Hey there, night owls. You think you know these stories? The resurrection, a flood, a giant boat packed with animals 2 by 2. You have heard them since you were a kid, but you have been missing something. Hidden in plain sight, tucked into names, numbers, and tiny details are meanings that quietly flip these stories upside down. And almost everyone walks right past them. So here's the game. Tonight I am handing you 25 of these hidden meanings, one after another. Keep score in your head. This is not your average Sunday school recap. We dig under the surface where the real secrets live. And I will just say it, I bet even someone who knows their theology cold does not walk away with a clean 25 out of 25. First one starts in a few seconds, but before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is where you are right now. All right, lights down, volume up, let us begin. Let us start with the smallest thing in the whole book, the thing your eyes slide over faster than anything else on the page. Names, long lists of them, mostly unpronounceable, the kind of passage people skip on their way to the parts with talking snakes and parting seas. And here is the very first secret of the night, hiding right there in the boring bit. In the ancient world, a name was never just a name, it was a compressed message, a tiny sealed envelope. Sometimes an entire prophecy folded down into a couple of syllables and handed to a newborn who had absolutely no say in the matter. Think about how we handle names today. We pick them because they sound pleasant, or because a grandparent had one, or because a character from a show we binged last winter had one. Meaning barely gets a seat at the table. In the world these texts come from, that logic was flipped completely upside down. A name was supposed to tell you who a person would become, what their parents were quietly hoping for, sometimes what heaven itself had allegedly already scheduled. Parents were not choosing a label to shout across the yard at dinner time. In their minds, they were writing a small piece of destiny and stapling it to a baby. No pressure, kid. You can feel how seriously they took this by how often a name simply is the person. The very first man in the story carries a name built from the word for ground, the reddish earth he was supposedly scooped out of, which is a poetic way of saying his name is basically dusty. The first woman is named for life itself because she is cast as the mother of everyone who comes after. And whenever someone in these pages undergoes a genuine change of fortune or character, the storytellers tend to hand them a brand new name to match, as if the old label no longer fit the person wearing it. One wandering herdsman has his name nudged by a single stretched syllable, shifting from something that means exalted father to something that means father of a multitude. And that tiny edit is presented as the entire hinge of his life, the exact moment his future officially changed shape. A name in this world was a status report, and rewriting the name was simply how you announced that the report had been revised. Parents sometimes went the other direction too, naming a child after the circumstances of the birth itself or after some event shaking the household at the time so that a name could double as a tiny, sealed time capsule of the exact moment it was given. A mood or a memory a family carried around on 2 legs for the rest of its life. And a few of these status reports were doing something so specific that the average reader has never once noticed. Let us start with the man who holds a record nobody has ever beaten. His name is Methuselah, and he supposedly lived 969 years. That is the one fact almost everyone knows about him, and honestly, it is the only fact most people want. He is the oldest human in the book, the record holder, the poster child for stubborn longevity, and then he presumably got a little tired and called it a career. That is the whole reputation, the old guy. Great at surviving, less celebrated for anything else, which is a shame because his name is one of the loudest hidden alarms in the entire collection, and almost nobody hears it going off. It helps to know who named him. Methuselah's father was Enoch, and Enoch is one of the genuinely strange figures in the early chapters, a man the text describes as walking so closely with the divine that one day he simply is not there anymore. No death scene, no funeral, no tomb. He is present, and then, in the tradition's own understated phrasing, he is gone, taken. This is the man who chose his son's name. And in the older tradition, Enoch was regarded as someone who received warnings about the future, which makes the name he picked feel a great deal less like a coincidence and a great deal more like a message he was told to leave behind in plain sight. Because when you pull the name apart, you find 2 building blocks. The first piece is tied to a root, meaning death. The second piece carries the sense of to send, to bring forth, to let loose upon the world. Line them up next to each other, and the name stops sounding like something you would coo at a baby and starts sounding like a countdown. When he dies, it will be sent. When this man is gone, it arrives, which is a genuinely unsettling thing to name your son, and you have to wonder how that first birthday party went. Congratulations on the boy, and also, apparently, on the doomsday clock quietly attached to him. Now here is where it gets almost suspiciously neat, and I want you to grab a calculator in your head because we are about to do some very light arithmetic. According to the text, Methuselah was 187 when his son Lamech was born. Lamech was 182 when his own son, a certain boat enthusiast named Noah, showed up. And Noah was 600 years old when the great flood arrived and rearranged the entire planet. Add those three numbers together, 187 plus 182 plus 600, that lands you on 969, which, if you were paying attention a moment ago, is the exact total of Methuselah's lifespan, right down to the year. Sit with that for a second. The man whose name allegedly means when he dies, it will be sent, turns out to have died in the very same year the flood came. Not a decade before, not a generation later, the same year, which, whether you read it as ancient literary craftsmanship or as something more, is an extraordinarily tidy piece of engineering. The traditional reading takes it even further and finds something rather tender hiding inside the grim math. If the reckoning was scheduled to arrive the moment Methuselah exhaled his last breath, then every one of those 969 years was heaven holding its breath. The old man was not just a longevity champion. He was a stay of execution with a heartbeat. As long as he kept waking up in the morning, the flood stayed parked in the garage. The longest life in the book quietly doubles as the longest act of patience in the book, a mercy stretched out to its absolute limit so that anyone who wanted to change course still had time. That is a much better epitaph than lived a really long time and then stopped, so the record holder was never really about the record. His name was a warning his relatives probably preferred not to think about too hard, and his lifespan was a countdown clock that also happened to be an act of restraint. Not bad for a fellow most people file under trivia. Let us jump forward a few thousand years of story to a name people say out loud all the time without ever noticing it is basically a riddle. Picture the scene at the trial, a restless crowd, a nervous official who would very much like this problem to belong to somebody else, and an old holiday custom of releasing one prisoner as a goodwill gesture, which was a strange tradition to run a justice system on. But we will let that slide for now. The official, hunting for an exit, offers the crowd a choice between two men. One of them is the accused teacher standing quietly in front of them, a man his judge cannot actually find a solid charge against. The other is a genuinely dangerous prisoner, someone tangled up in armed rebellion, and depending on which account you read, at least one killing. His name is Barabbas. Here is what almost nobody in that crowd registers, and what most readers since have missed too. Barabbas is not really a personal name at all, not the way we think of names. It is a description wearing a name's clothing. Break it into its pieces, and you get Bar, meaning son of, and Abba, meaning the father. Barabbas, quite literally, means son of the father. And it gets sharper because a number of the oldest surviving manuscripts hand this man a first name that most modern printings quietly dropped somewhere along the centuries. In those older copies, he is not just Barabbas, he is Jesus Barabbas. Now, to us that lands like a thunderclap, but to ancient ears it was far more ordinary, because that name was extremely common at the time, roughly as unremarkable as being named something like John or Michael today. There were Jesuses everywhere. The name was practically wallpaper. You can actually watch later copyists getting uncomfortable with the overlap. Scribes who revered one of those two men were understandably squeamish about a murderer sharing the exact same first name, and over time the shared name tends to quietly vanish from the manuscripts, sanded off like a splinter nobody wanted to keep touching. Which is its own small tell. If the detail were meaningless, nobody would have bothered erasing it. But look at what the scene becomes once you put that detail back. The official stands in front of a mob and offers them two men who, on paper, share the exact same name and the exact same title. On one side, Jesus, son of the Father, a violent man wrapped up in insurrection. On the other side, Jesus, who according to the story claims to be the true son of the Father in a far deeper and more literal sense than any label could carry. Two men, same name, same title. One of them the genuine article, the other a counterfeit with the correct sticker on the box. And the crowd, handed this bizarre matched set, roars for the counterfeit to walk free and sends the original off to be executed. They pick the copy over the source, the imposter over the real thing, the man who takes life over the man who, per the plot, is about to hand over his own. Whatever you personally believe about any of it, you have to admit that is a devastating piece of irony built entirely out of one shared name, and it is completely invisible if you do not know that Barabbas was less a name and more a signpost pointing in two directions at once. And the choice was not the random spasm of an angry mob that it can look like from a comfortable distance. The crowd knew perfectly well what each man was. The rebel had taken up arms against the occupier, which in the eyes of a great many made him not a common criminal but a freedom fighter, exactly the kind of muscular, sword-swinging liberator a conquered people had been aching for through years of humiliation. The teacher, by contrast, kept talking about a kingdom that did not appear to involve driving anyone into the sea at all, which to a frustrated crowd under the boot of Rome must have sounded maddeningly beside the point. So they did not simply choose chaos over order. They chose the revolutionary they understood over the one they did not, the sword they wanted over the peace they were being offered, the fighter who promised to hurt their enemies over the man who kept insisting on forgiving them, which somehow makes the whole swap land even harder. That is the thing about these names. They are not decoration, they are load-bearing. And that brings us to the boldest example of the three, the one that either gives you goosebumps or makes you fold your arms in deep suspicion, and I am going to be straight with you about which reaction is the sensible one. Go back to that opening genealogy, the family line that runs from the first man all the way down to the flood builder. 10 names in a row, the sort of list that gets read aloud at exactly the speed required to sedate a room. Now, each of those names has a rough traditional meaning attached to it, the way Methuselah supposedly carries that death is coming sense we already walk through. And someone at some point had the idea to line all 10 meanings up in order and read them as a single continuous sentence, as if the family tree were secretly a coded message rather than a phone book. Let us actually walk it, because that is more fun than being told the result. The first man's name, as we said, means man. His son's name carries the sense of appointed or set in place. The next generation gives a name tied to mortal, and the one after that a name linked to sorrow or misery, which is not exactly a cheerful nursery so far. Then comes a name meaning something like the blessed God, followed by one that carries the idea of coming down or descending, followed by our old friend Methuselah with his death shall bring. The line rounds off with a name tied to the despairing or the stricken, and finally with Noah, whose name is traditionally connected to rest and comfort. Now read the whole chain as one breath. Man is appointed to mortal sorrow, but the blessed God shall come down, and his death shall bring the stricken rest and comfort. 10 ordinary names, most of which people have skimmed past for centuries, allegedly hiding a one-sentence summary of the entire story the rest of the book is straining to tell. Thousands of years before that story is supposed to arrive. Now, deep breath. This is the part where I put my honest hat on, because you deserve better than a magic trick presented as a fact. That reading is beautiful, and it is also genuinely disputed, and both of those things are true at the same time. The problem is that ancient Hebrew names frequently allow more than one plausible meaning. And to make the sentence land as smoothly as it does, you have to reach for the friendliest, most cooperative definition at nearly every step. Choose slightly different but equally defensible meanings, and the elegant sentence starts to wobble and lose its polish. Some scholars regard the whole thing as a charming coincidence at best, and a bit of motivated wishful thinking at worst. Others find it too clean to be an accident. I'm not going to tell you which camp is correct because, frankly, nobody can prove it either way, and anyone who tells you they can is quietly selling you something. What I will tell you is that this is exactly the kind of claim you can go and check yourself, which is more than you can say for most of the things that get passed around as astonishing. Look up the 10 names, look up the range of meanings each one honestly allows. Then see whether the sentence still holds together when you are the one choosing the definitions, instead of trusting someone who very badly wants it to work. Maybe you come away quietly convinced. Maybe you come away rolling your eyes so hard you strain something. Either way, you will have actually done the work, which already puts you miles ahead of the crowd of people who repeat this at dinner parties without ever once looking a single name up. And that is the whole point of this first stretch of the night. Whether you land on skeptic or believer, the pattern is undeniable at the level of the individual names we can actually verify. In this book, names function like signatures pressed into wet clay. They carry warnings, ironies, and reversals that the surface of the text never announces out loud. The author, whoever you think that author is, keeps signing the margins in a code most readers never learn to read. So the next time your eyes hit a wall of unfamiliar names and start to glaze, remember that at least a few of them are not filler. They are the fine print. And the fine print, as always, is where they keep the good stuff. Now, if names are the fine print, numbers are the wiring behind the wall. And this is where I have to head off a misunderstanding before it even gets started. Because the moment anyone says the words biblical numbers out loud, half the room instantly pictures a wild-eyed figure with a corkboard and a spool of red string, connecting the price of grain in ancient Egypt to next season's football scores. That is not what we are doing here. Nobody is predicting lottery draws. What we are talking about is something far more grounded and honestly far more interesting, which is that the people who assembled these texts used certain numbers on purpose, as a kind of shorthand, the way a filmmaker drops a particular musical cue to tell you exactly how to feel a full 3 seconds before anything actually happens on screen. This was not a quirk unique to one culture either. The whole ancient world thought in symbolic numbers. Their neighbors up and down the region attached weight and personality to specific figures, so a reader back then walked into these stories already fluent in a language modern readers have almost entirely forgotten. Certain numbers meant certain things. 7 carried the sense of a finished, complete whole. 12 belonged to the nation and its structure. 3 suggested something firm and settled. And when one of these loaded numbers showed up, an ancient reader felt a small nudge in the ribs that a modern reader sails straight past without a flicker. Learn the nudges, and a second layer of the text quietly switches itself on. The good news is that this is a genuinely learnable skill rather than some secret reserved for scholars in dusty libraries. It works the same way you already read the visual grammar of a film without ever being taught it. When the music goes low and slow and the camera drifts toward a dark hallway, you brace yourself because you have absorbed the code even though nobody sat you down and explained it. Ancient readers carried the same kind of instinct for numbers. A 7 landed with a little chime of completion. A 12 rang with the whole nation. Once you install even a handful of these values, the text stops being a flat surface of events and starts behaving like a page with footnotes printed in invisible ink, warming into view the moment you know to look. Let us begin with a scene that is dramatic on the surface and downright political the moment you notice the numbers hiding inside it. A man lives out among the tombs, tormented, so violently strong that no chain can hold him, the sort of figure the whole region has long since given up on and avoids after dark. This is happening, worth noting, in a stretch of land dotted with a cluster of Greek-influenced cities on the fringe of the Jewish world, a region where a great many of the inhabitants were not Jewish at all, which is going to matter in about a minute. The teacher arrives by boat, and instead of running, he walks straight up to the most feared man in the district and asks the tormenting presence inside him for its name. The answer that comes back is a single loaded word: legion. Now, most people hear that and take it to mean, roughly, a whole lot, a crowd, many. And that is not wrong, but it is like hearing someone say battalion and assuming it just means a few extra guys. A legion was not a vague word for a big number. A legion was a specific, terrifying, thoroughly Roman thing. It was a full unit of the Roman army, somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 to 6,000 professional soldiers, the single largest and most disciplined hammer in the ancient world's entire toolbox, and the exact instrument of the empire that was, at that very moment, sitting on top of that land with its full weight. So the tormented man does not simply say, "There are a lot of us in here." He answers with the name of an occupying army. And to an audience living every day under the boot of that army, that one word carried a charge that has almost completely drained out of it for us. This is no longer just a scary story about a haunted man in a graveyard. It has quietly turned into a story about power, and very specifically about who has more of it, the empire or the unarmed teacher standing calmly on the shore. Then it gets even more pointed. The presence begs not to be sent away and instead asks to be allowed into a nearby herd of pigs. The text bothers to give us the exact number of pigs, and the number is 2,000, which is worth stopping on for two reasons. First, pigs were considered thoroughly unclean animals in Jewish culture, the very last creature you would ever want your name attached to. So their presence at all signals that we are firmly on non-Jewish turf, which fits that region of mixed cities perfectly. Second, 2,000 pigs is not some quaint little farmstead with a couple of hogs named after the kids. That is an industrial operation, a serious commercial enterprise, which tells you a fair amount about who is really running the local economy and profiting from it. And here's the detail that flips the entire scene from nature incident to political theater. The Roman legion stationed in that very corner of the world, Legio X Fretensis, the 10th legion, carried among its official military emblems the image of a boar, a pig. Their standards, their coins, their whole battlefield brand identity prominently featured the animal. Now reassemble the scene with that tucked into your back pocket. An occupying presence that names itself with the word for a Roman army gets sent, at a single quiet word from the teacher, into a herd of the exact animal that decorated that army's banners, and the entire lot of them promptly stampede off a cliff and drown themselves in the sea. To a first-century listener living under occupation, that was not subtle. That was practically a political cartoon. That was the empire's own mascot charging into the water and sinking without a fight, ordered around like a misbehaving dog and dispatched with less effort than it takes to swat a fly. Whatever else the story is doing on a spiritual level, it is also on the ground floor, making an audience of the occupied grin into their sleeves. The teacher, it announces, holds authority not only over whatever torments a single broken man, but over the entire terrifying apparatus of Rome itself. You cannot see one bit of that if 2,000 is just a big round number to you. Once you know it is the census of a very particular herd wearing, symbolically, a very particular uniform, the scene changes genre entirely. There are two more layers worth lifting here. One that lands from inside the story, and one that only history could add from the outside. The first is what happens to the man himself once the storm inside him has drowned. He ends the scene clothed, calm, seated, and entirely in his right mind. And when he begs to leave with the teacher, he is instead sent back to his own people to tell them what has happened to him. His mission field is that same cluster of non-Jewish cities, which means the very first person dispatched to carry this news into outsider territory is a formerly tomb-dwelling, demon-tormented pig country local, a casting choice no marketing department would ever have approved. The message reaches the outsiders first through the least likely spokesman available, and that is clearly on purpose. The second layer is a grim piece of historical irony the original audience could not possibly have felt. That same 10th Legion, the one whose boar emblem swims through this little story and sinks, would decades later be among the units that besieged and flattened the great city at the very heart of the nation. The empire whose mascot drowned in a lake in this quiet scene would go on to do very real and very terrible things in the world, which lends the image of those stampeding pigs an edge that only the passage of time could sharpen. Numbers keep doing this quiet double duty everywhere you look, and once you catch the trick, you genuinely cannot switch it back off. Take the most famous picnic in history, the day a massive, hungry crowd, numbered at 5,000, gets fed to bursting from a laughably small amount of food. Everyone remembers the impossible arithmetic of the meal itself. Almost nobody remembers the number at the very end, which is the number actually carrying the message. When the crowd finishes eating, the leftovers get gathered up, and the text is oddly specific that there are exactly 12 baskets left over. 12, not 10, not a dozen-ish, not some vague heap of scraps. 12. And 12, as we just noted, is the least random number available in this entire tradition, because it is the number of the tribes of the nation itself. 12 tribes, 12 baskets. The meal is not just a snack that got wonderfully out of hand. It is quietly stamped with the number of the whole people, a signal that this overflowing abundance belongs to and is meant for the entire nation, all 12 parts of it, with far more left over than they started with. The leftover count is the actual sermon. The bread was merely the delivery vehicle. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how gloriously oblivious the teacher's closest followers are through all of this, because it makes the second round genuinely funny. Having personally watched a few loaves stretched to feed an entire stadium, and having personally hauled away 12 overflowing baskets of the extras afterward, They roll up to the next enormous hungry crowd and immediately begin fretting about where on earth anyone is supposed to find enough food out here in the middle of nowhere. The very men who did the cleanup after the first miracle have somehow filed the whole astonishing event under things that will surely never happen a second time. If you have ever completely forgotten a lesson you learned barely a chapter ago in your own life, take some comfort. You are keeping excellent company. Here is where it gets genuinely clever, because there is a second, less famous version of this same kind of event, and the storytellers change exactly one number in order to change the whole meaning. In the second feeding, the crowd is numbered at 4,000 rather than 5, and when the leftovers get counted this time, there are 7 baskets, not 12. 7, remember, is the number of completeness, of fullness, of the finished and whole. And the detail most readers breeze right past, the one that flips the switch, is where the second meal takes place. It happens back over on that other side, in the mixed, non-Jewish territory we visited a moment ago with the pigs, among people outside the nation entirely. The first meal, stamped with 12, was for the home crowd. The second meal, stamped with 7, unfolds on outsider ground and carries the number of everyone, of the complete set, of all peoples rather than one single nation. There is even a small linguistic fingerprint on this that most translations flatten out. The word used for the baskets in the first feeding is a smaller, distinctly Jewish sort of basket, while the word used in the second is a different, larger kind, the sort that would carry a grown man over a wall in another famous escape scene later on. Different crowds, different territory, different baskets, even different vocabulary. Read side by side, the 2 picnics are telling one continuous story with nothing but leftover counts and a change of scenery. First, abundance for the 12 tribes. Then, that same abundance carried across the border and restamped with the number of completeness, quietly announcing that the guest list is being extended past the original invitations to include, well, everybody. 2 nearly identical miracles, and the entire difference between them lives in 2 baskets and a change of address. That is not sloppy repetition, which is what a casual reader assumes when they hit the second feeding and grumble that they have already read this one. It is the same idea rung deliberately on 2 different bells, which brings us to the number that turns up so relentlessly it practically deserves its own paycheck. If you read enough of these texts, one figure starts trailing you around like a stray cat that has decided you are its person now, and that number is 40. It appears at the hinge of nearly every major turning point in the entire collection, so reliably that it stops looking like a measurement and starts looking like a signal flare fired off to say, pay attention, something is about to change. Let us do a quick roll call, and I promise the pattern will announce itself long before we run out of examples. The great flood we already visited arrives on the back of rain that falls for 40 days. When the newly freed nation, wandering out of slavery, sends scouts ahead to inspect the promised land, those scouts spend 40 days exploring it before coming back with a report so faint-hearted it changes history. And as a direct punishment for that failure of nerve, the nation is then sentenced to wander lost in the desert for 40 years. 1 full year for each of those 40 scouting days, which is a rather poetic and slightly savage way to run a justice system. When the lawgiver climbs the sacred mountain to receive the founding rules of the whole people, he stays up there without food for 40 days. When the great prophet flees for his life and journeys to that same mountain to meet the divine in a whisper, his journey takes 40 days. When the teacher, centuries later, walks out into the wilderness to be tested before beginning his public work, he fasts for 40 days. When a reluctant prophet is finally bullied onto a boat and then into a doomed city to announce that its time is nearly up, the deadline he is given to shout through the streets is 40 days. And when a towering warrior strides out to taunt an entire terrified army, morning and evening, daring any of them to face him, he keeps the challenge up for exactly 40 days before a shepherd boy with a sling and a great deal of nerve finally puts a stop to it. Even after the central story reaches its climax, the pattern holds, because the risen teacher spends 40 days among his followers before departing. Wherever the tradition wants to mark a genuine threshold, 40 is standing there like a bouncer at the door. And the number's not shy about the smaller doorways either. When the great patriarch dies far from his homeland, the careful process of preparing his body for the long journey back takes 40 days. The legal codes cap a certain courtroom punishment at 40 strokes, a limit later observed so nervously, out of pure terror of accidentally miscounting one over the line, that it was voluntarily knocked down to 39 just to be safe, which is one of the most relatable pieces of bookkeeping in the entire book. The number keeps turning up in the old rituals around mourning and waiting and cleansing until over the long stretch of centuries it simply settled into the collective bones as the length of a complete and rounded season, long enough for something to fully finish or for something new to fully begin. Flood, scouting, wandering, mountain, mountain again, wilderness, a doomed city, a doomed giant, a final farewell. A whole parade of enormous, otherwise unrelated moments, and the same number is bolted onto every last one of them. At that point, coincidence stops being a reasonable explanation. 40 is not measuring anything precise. 40 is a label the storytellers reach for whenever a character is being put through the ringer, whenever a stretch of testing has to be crossed before something genuinely new can begin on the far side of it. It is the number of the trial, the number of the long, hard passage, the length of a full generation, the span it takes to leave one version of yourself behind and arrive as another. It tells an ancient reader before anything else even happens that whoever is standing at the start of these 40 units is going to be a different person by the time they come out the other end. It is, in effect, an entire mood expressed as a duration. There is even a reasonable guess as to why the storytellers kept landing on 40 rather than, say, 30 or 50. 40 was roughly the span the ancient world associated with a full generation, the stretch of time it takes for one crop of people to grow up, take the reins, and eventually hand everything off to the next. That is almost certainly no accident in the wandering story, where the entire point of the 40-year sentence is that a whole generation has to age out and pass away before the nation is finally allowed to move forward, as if the land itself were patiently waiting for a complete changing of the guard. So the number is not merely long, it is long in a very specific, very human way. It is the length of a whole chapter of a life, the amount of time it genuinely takes to become a different person, which is precisely why it keeps getting bolted onto characters who walk into a story as one thing and are meant to stagger out of it as another. 40 is simply how the text spells transformation without ever having to use the word, and this is the small superpower I want to hand you before we move on, because it costs nothing and it turns reading into a treasure hunt. The next time you meet one of these stories and a number lands in your lap, do not let your eyes skate over it the way you have your entire life. Stop for half a second and ask what the number might quietly be doing there, especially that number 40. Once you start watching for it, you will spot it turning up at nearly every hinge and threshold in the book, and each time it appears it is whispering the same thing under its breath, which is that a difficult crossing is now underway and nobody comes out the far side quite the same as they went in. The count is never just a count, it is the storyteller tapping you on the shoulder and telling you how to feel about what is coming a beat before it arrives. Names were the signatures hidden in the margins, numbers are the mood lighting wired into the walls. And we are still only getting warmed up because the deeper into this we go, the stranger and more specific the details are about to get. So far we have been playing archaeologist with the text itself, digging under the surface of names and numbers to pull out messages the original writers buried there on purpose. But there is a second kind of hidden meaning, and it is arguably sneakier because nobody buried it on purpose at all. It got hidden by time. 20 centuries of distance have quietly stripped away a whole layer of context that the first audiences carried around automatically. The way you and I know without thinking that a person who shows up to a funeral in a bright yellow costume has done something deeply wrong. They would not need it explained. We do. And when that context goes missing, we keep reading the words just fine while completely misplacing the story. The trouble is that we do not read these scenes as blank slates. We drag our own assumptions in with us like mud on our shoes. We picture the settings like a stage play we already know. We assume the characters value what we value, and we quietly rewrite the emotional temperature of a scene to match our own century. Most of the time, nobody notices because the surface still makes a kind of sense. But sense is not the same thing as accuracy, and a few of the most beloved stories in the entire collection turn out to mean something almost startlingly different once you put the original cultural glasses back on. Let us try a few on. Start with a story so famous it has escaped the book entirely and become a word people use for anyone who wanders off and comes back. The one about the younger son who demands his inheritance early, blows the whole thing on a spectacular losing streak, and eventually comes crawling home. You know the shape of it, what you almost certainly do not feel sitting in the modern world, is how many small social bombs are going off in every paragraph. Take the opening move. The younger son walks up to his very much alive father and asks for his share of the estate right now. To our ears, that lands as rude and a little entitled, the sort of thing that gets you a lecture. To the original audience, it was something closer to monstrous. In that world, you received your inheritance when your father died, full stop. To march up and demand it early was to say, out loud, that you wish the old man were already in the ground, and you simply could not be bothered to wait. It was a death wish with paperwork. And in a culture built almost entirely around honor and family loyalty, a father would have been fully within his rights and fully expected to respond with fury, disinheritance, and possibly a public thrashing to remind the neighborhood who was in charge. Instead, and this is the first quiet shock of the story, the father just does it. He divides the estate and hands it over, absorbing an insult that would have flattened most patriarchs of the day. Nobody in the original crowd would have relaxed at that. They would have leaned forward, uneasy, waiting for the disaster everyone could see coming. And the disaster duly arrives. The boy converts his share to cash, which already means selling off a chunk of ancestral family land to strangers, a betrayal of the whole clan and not just one man. He travels far away and burns through everything, and a famine finishes the job. He ends up doing the single most degrading work the storyteller could possibly assign a Jewish boy, feeding pigs, the very animal, you may recall, that a certain herd of 2,000 recently demonstrated is considered thoroughly unclean in this culture. He is so far gone that he eyes the pig's food with something like envy, which is the storyteller efficiently telling us the young man has hit a floor so low there is no lower. Now comes the moment everyone thinks they understand, and almost nobody does. The son rehearses a little speech, swallows his pride, and starts the long walk home, presumably braced for the cold reception he has coming. And while he is still a good distance off, the father sees him and runs. That single verb, runs, is where the whole scene detonates for anyone who knows the culture. A distinguished older man in that society did not run, ever. Running was for children, for servants, for people with no standing to lose. A patriarch moved slowly, deliberately, with the unbothered dignity of someone the whole world waited on. Worse, to actually run, this elderly man would have had to grab the hem of his long flowing robe and hike it up around his knees, baring his legs in public like a boy racing through a field. For a man of his rank, that was a humiliation, a deliberate stripping away of his own honor in front of the entire village. And that is precisely the point most retellings miss entirely. There is a decent case that the father was not only running out of joy, he was running to reach his son first, before the boy could enter the village and face the community, which by local custom had every right to shame and reject a son who had squandered the family fortune among outsiders. The father sprints out to intercept the disgrace and take it onto himself, absorbing the public humiliation his son had earned so that the son would never have to walk that gauntlet alone. The old man trades his dignity for the boy in the middle of the road, in front of everyone, before the son has managed to stammer out even half of his prepared apology. And then the details of the welcome, which we tend to hear as generic party supplies, turn out to be a precise checklist of total legal reinstatement. The best robe is not just a nice outfit, it is the father's own robe of honor, publicly draping the returned son in the family status he had thrown away. The ring is a signet ring, the ancient equivalent of handing someone your official seal and your credit line, a restoration of full authority to act in the family name, which is a remarkable thing to give a young man whose track record with money we have just reviewed in some detail. The sandals matter too, because in that household free sons wore shoes, and slaves went barefoot, so putting sandals on his feet is a pointed announcement that he is coming back as a son and not as the hired hand he had planned to beg to become. And the fattened calf was not the household default dinner. It was the animal you kept on hand for a genuinely major celebration, enough meat to feed the entire village, which means the father is throwing not a quiet family reunion but a full public feast, forcing the whole community to sit down and celebrate the very person they were entitled to reject. The father does not put the boy on probation. He does not make him earn his way back with a trial period as a farmhand. He restores him completely, instantly, and loudly, at real cost to his own reputation, which is a far more staggering thing than the sentimental version we usually settle for. And the story is not even done handing out cultural landmines because there is a second son, and his part carries its own quiet scandal that most retellings treat as a minor sulk. The older brother, out working in the fields like the dutiful one he is, hears the music, learns what the party is for, and refuses to go in. Now, to modern ears, that reads as a reasonable, if slightly bitter reaction to a genuinely unfair situation, and we tend to give him a sympathetic nod. To the original audience, it was another public outrage. In that world, the elder son was expected to help host his father's feast, to stand at the door and welcome the guests, and to publicly honor his father in front of the whole village. By planting himself outside and refusing to come in, he was shaming his father a second time, in front of the same crowd, on the same day, essentially staging his own small rebellion in parallel to his brother's. And the father, astonishingly, does the undignified thing all over again. He leaves his own celebration, walks out into the yard, and pleads with the angry son to come in, humbling himself a second time in a single afternoon, this time for the boy who never left. Two sons, two very different ways of breaking a father's heart, and one father who keeps stepping outside and lowering himself to fetch them both. The story quietly refuses to let the well-behaved brother off the hook, which is a good deal more pointed than the tidy tale of one wanderer coming home. The same trick, sacrifice dignity meeting unexpected acceptance, drives another crowd favorite, though this one comes with a much shorter man. Picture a wealthy official in a bustling town, the head tax collector for the district, which in that era was roughly the least popular job available. Tax collectors worked for the occupying empire, squeezed their own neighbors, and routinely padded the bill to line their own pockets, so they were despised as both traitors and thieves, a rare 2-for-1. This particular man was very good at it, which is a polite way of saying very rich, and correspondingly very hated. He was also, the text is a little blunt about this, short. When word spreads that the famous teacher is passing through, this small, wealthy, thoroughly detested man wants to see him, and he runs into a very ordinary problem. He cannot see over the crowd, and the crowd, one suspects, is in no particular hurry to make room for the local swindler. So he does something that, for a person of his wealth and position, was almost unthinkable. He runs ahead and climbs a tree, a sycamore fig, conveniently low-branched, but still a tree. In that culture, dignified grown men did not run, and they absolutely did not scramble up trees like 8-year-olds. Both actions belonged to children and were beneath the notice of a man of standing. So here is one of the richest, most powerful men in town, voluntarily making a public spectacle of himself, hauling himself up into the branches in his fine clothes for a glimpse of a passing rabbi. He throws away his dignity, the one thing his money was supposed to protect, just to see. And the teacher stops directly under the tree, looks up, calls him by name, and invites himself over for dinner. To the watching crowd, this was scandalous on two fronts at once. First, teachers of any repute did not stroll into the homes of collaborators and cheats. Sharing a meal was an act of acceptance and honoring a man like this was practically an endorsement of everything the town hated about him. Second, the whole point of the collector's climb had been to observe quietly from a distance, and instead he gets singled out by name in front of everyone he has ever overcharged. The response is immediate and expensive. The man announces he will give half of everything he owns to the poor, and that he will repay anyone he has cheated 4 times over, which is worth noting because the law only required paying back the original amount plus a modest bit extra. He volunteers a penalty far steeper than anyone could have demanded, the kind of restitution reserved for outright theft, and he applies it to his entire career. Dignity thrown away, met by acceptance rather than the scorn he had every reason to expect, produces a transformation no lecture ever could. Salvation, the teacher says, has arrived at this house today, and he restores the little man to the community he had been cut off from, calling him a true son of the family line rather than the traitor everyone else saw. The lesson lands only if you feel how much that tree cost him. It is worth adding that the crowd did not applaud this moment either. They grumbled openly that the teacher had chosen to be the house guest of a notorious sinner, which tells you the acceptance on offer here was not the cheap, comfortable kind. It was the sort that scandalized the respectable onlookers and cost the teacher a little of his own reputation in exactly the way the father in the earlier story lost his, and in exactly the way the small man in the tree had just lost his. The pattern is the same every time. dignity spent freely on someone the crowd had already written off. Now for one where the cultural detail people think they know is actually the wrong one, and the truth is both simpler and sharper. There is a famous line about how it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom. It is one of the most quoted sayings in the whole collection, and it comes attached to one of the most stubborn and comforting pieces of folklore ever invented. You have probably heard it. The story goes that there was a small gate in the wall of the ancient city, a low, narrow pedestrian door nicknamed the Needle's Eye, and that a camel could just barely squeeze through it if you unloaded all its baggage and it got down on its knees and shuffled. Tidy, right? The rich man can get in after all, he just has to kneel down and drop his stuff first. It is a lovely little sermon, and it makes everyone in the pews feel much more comfortable. There's only one problem with it. It appears to be completely made up. There is no archaeological evidence and no historical record from the period of any gate in that city by that name in the 1st century. The charming story of the crouching camel does not show up anywhere until roughly 1,000 years later, in the notes of medieval commentators who, one strongly suspects, were doing exactly what that comfortable sermon does, looking for a way to soften a teaching that clearly made people squirm. Over the centuries, the invented gate got repeated so often and so confidently that it hardened into a fact, which is a fine example of how a good story will beat an inconvenient truth in a foot race nearly every time. A separate attempt to diffuse the line suggests the original word was not camel, but a very similar word meaning rope or thick cord, which at least keeps you in the sewing metaphor. But that too reads mostly as another effort to make the impossible sound merely difficult. Because impossible is the entire point. The teacher was not handing out a logistics tip about baggage management. He was using a deliberately absurd, almost comic image, the largest animal anyone in the region could picture set against the smallest hole imaginable, a bit of intentional exaggeration in the grand tradition of vivid teachers everywhere. There were similar sayings floating around the ancient world using an elephant and a needle for exactly the same reason. The image is supposed to be ridiculous. It is supposed to make you laugh and then wince, and we do not have to guess whether the original listeners understood it as an impossibility, because their reaction is right there in the text. They were not comforted at all. They were stunned, and they asked essentially, well then who on earth can possibly be saved? Which is not the response of people who just heard a manageable tip about kneeling camels. They heard a door slamming. It helps to know why the news hit them quite so hard, because it was not simply sympathy for wealthy people. In that culture, there was a widespread assumption that material prosperity was itself a visible sign of divine approval. A reasonable guess that if a person was rich, healthy, and comfortable, heaven must be pleased with them. By that logic, the wealthy were not the long shots for the kingdom, they were the front runners, the people you would have bet on first. So when the teacher declared that these apparent favorites of heaven faced an outright impossibility, he was not just picking on the rich, he was pulling the floor out from under everyone because the disciples reasoned exactly the way we would expect. If the people who seem the most blessed cannot manage it, then what conceivable hope is there for the rest of us ordinary strugglers? Their panic was not confusion, it was the entirely logical conclusion of watching their whole scoreboard get thrown out. And the real key, the thing the invented gate story actually buries, is the very next line, the one people skip right past on their way to the cozy version. The teacher looks at their alarm and says that this is indeed impossible for human beings to pull off, but that with God, every impossibility is back on the table. That is the punchline the whole scene was building toward. The rescue of a rich man, or frankly of anyone, was never meant to be a matter of finding the right technique, unloading the right baggage, and squeezing through on your own steam. It was always meant to be a flat impossibility from the human side that only becomes possible as an outright gift from the other side. The made-up gate accidentally reverses the entire meaning, turning a story about grace doing the impossible into a story about self-improvement doing the achievable, which is a smaller, sadder, and much less interesting idea than the one that was actually there. Pull these three together and you can see the shared lessons snap into focus. In every case, the plain English words survived the trip across 2,000 years perfectly intact, and in every case the meaning quietly fell out along the way, because meaning does not live in the words alone. It lives in the culture and the language wrapped around them. the assumptions about honor and shame and dignity and money that the first hearers never had to be told. Strip that away and you are left holding a photograph with the color drained out of it, still recognizable, still technically the same image, but missing the very thing that made it land. Put the color back, and stories you thought you had memorized turn out to be sharper, stranger, and considerably more generous than the flattened versions we inherited. Culture is the lens. Without it, you are reading a slightly wrong story and never knowing it. Now let us pull the camera back even further, because there is a layer beneath the cultural one that is stranger still. So far, we have talked about meanings hidden in the words and meanings hidden by time. But the text also insists, over and over, that many of its most famous events are only the visible surface of something else entirely, a second conflict happening just out of frame, where we see a natural disaster, a stretch of bad weather, or a bureaucratic headcount. The writers keep telling us there is a battle going on and that the earthquake we are watching is really just the furniture rattling from a fight in the next room. The background, it turns out, is its own plot, and once you start noticing it, you cannot unnotice it. Begin with the most spectacular sequence of catastrophes in the whole collection, the run of disasters that hammers an ancient superpower until it finally lets an enslaved people walk free. We tend to read those calamities as an escalating series of natural gross-outs, a kind of ancient disaster movie where the special effects keep getting bigger. Frogs, then bugs, then boils, and so on, up the ladder until the grand finale. Read that way, it is just God turning up the volume until the stubborn ruler cracks. But the text itself hands us a very different reading, stating outright that these blows were aimed not merely at the land, but at the gods of the land, a systematic judgment against the entire national pantheon. And once you know which disaster targets which deity, the whole sequence stops looking like random escalation and starts looking like a precise, methodical demolition, taking down the local gods one by one in the order best calculated to humiliate them. Consider the opener. The great river, the literal lifeblood of the whole civilization, turns to blood and death. Now, that river was not just water to them, it was practically a person. It had its own god presiding over its life-giving flood, the annual miracle that made the desert bloom. And the river was also bound up with the myth of the great god of the dead, imagined in some tellings as the very bloodstream of the nation. So the very first blow does not just poison the drinking supply. It takes the single most sacred, most reliable source of divine blessing in the entire land, the thing that supposedly proved the gods were watching over the people, and turns it into a stinking channel of death. It is a message aimed straight at a god, delivered by ruining that god's whole resume on day one. The pattern keeps going with a dark sense of humor baked in. A plague of frogs might sound merely disgusting until you learn that a frog-headed goddess presided over fertility and birth, so the land gets buried under a smothering, croaking overabundance of her own sacred symbol, which is a bit like a fertility god cursing you with more blessings than you can stand. When a disease sweeps through the livestock, it strikes at a culture that worshipped a sacred bull and a mother goddess pictured as a cow, so their divine animals drop dead in the fields, gods with hooves proving unable to protect even themselves. Each disaster is a targeted embarrassment, a public demonstration that the deity supposedly in charge of exactly this domain cannot do the one thing they exist to do. Then comes one of the most pointed of all. A thick, oppressive darkness falls over the land for 3 straight days, so heavy the text describes it as a darkness you could practically feel, and people cannot even see one another. On the surface, spooky weather. Underneath, a direct strike at the supreme deity of the entire civilization, the sun god, the chief of the gods, and the divine patron the ruler himself claimed kinship with. Blotting out the sun for 3 days was not a lighting problem. It was a public execution of the head of the pantheon, the brightest and most powerful god in the sky, snuffed out like a cheap candle, while his supposed descendant on the throne could do nothing but sit in the dark and wait for it to pass. And the grand finale, the loss of the firstborn throughout the land, lands hardest of all precisely because the ruler himself was regarded as a living god and his heir as the next god-king in waiting. Striking the firstborn was a blow aimed at the very top of the divine family tree, the dynasty of gods on earth, proving that not even the god-king could shield his own household. There is one more feature of the sequence that quietly confirms this was a targeted operation rather than indiscriminate bad luck. and it is the growing line drawn straight through the middle of the land. As the disasters mount, the text is increasingly careful to note that the region where the enslaved people lived was spared, the flies and the hail and the darkness stopping at an invisible border while the rest of the country suffered. A random run of natural catastrophes does not politely check the address before deciding whom to ruin. This one did, which is the storyteller's way of insisting that every blow was aimed with intent, sorting the land into those under judgment and those under protection with a precision no weather system has ever managed. The disasters were not spilling out of control. They were being conducted like an orchestra, one deliberate movement at a time. And here's the detail that quietly announces the outcome of the entire contest before the first real plague even lands, the sort of thing you only catch on a slow second reading. Early on in the throne room, there is a strange little duel of staffs. The prophet's brother throws down his staff and it becomes a serpent, and the ruler's own court magicians, unimpressed, throw down their staffs and produce serpents of their own, presumably to a smattering of polite applause. But then the prophet's serpent calmly swallows all the others whole. Now, why a serpent, and why does swallowing matter so much? Because the rearing cobra was the emblem mounted on the front of the ruler's crown, the sacred symbol of his sovereignty and divine protection, the very image of royal power in that culture. So this opening scene is not a magic trick, it is a spoiler. The symbol of the enslaved people's god devours the symbol of the god king right there on the palace floor, quietly announcing the result of the whole coming showdown before a single frog has hopped. The gods duel first in miniature, and the audience with the right eyes already knows who wins. The same hidden war shows up centuries later in a story people usually file under weather. And once you see the target, the whole thing reorganizes itself. A lone prophet marches up to a wicked king and announces that there will be no rain, none at all, not so much as a drop of dew until he says otherwise. On the face of it, this is a prophet threatening a drought, which sounds harsh but generic. But the choice of weapon is anything but generic because the region in question was busy worshipping a storm god, a deity whose entire brand, whose one enormous job, was bringing the rain and the fertility that rain made possible. He was the rider of the clouds, the god you prayed to when you wanted your fields to grow. So a drought was not a random hardship, it was a precision strike at that god's single core competency. And this was no fringe skirmish with a handful of village idol worshippers, which is part of why the stakes ran so high. The storm god cult had, by this point, been installed more or less as the official state religion, actively promoted from the throne itself. The king had married into a foreign royal house and brought its religion home with him, and that arrangement came with an aggressive program of stamping out the rivals, to the point that prophets of the older faith were being hunted and forced into hiding. So the lone prophet marching in to shut off the rain was not lodging a polite theological complaint. He was directly challenging a national cult backed by the full power of the crown, in a moment when doing so was a genuinely dangerous way to spend your afternoon. The drought was aimed at a god, yes, but also at the entire state apparatus that had staked its legitimacy on that god delivering the goods. And this is the part that makes it quietly devastating. The drought drags on not for a week, but for years, which means every single rainless morning was a public referendum, a slow, grinding, unmissable demonstration that the storm god, the great supplier of rain, could not produce rain, could not even squeeze out a light drizzle, no matter how many people begged him for it. It was a humiliation delivered in the most patient way imaginable, one dry sunrise at a time, month after month after month, until the god's reputation had simply crumbled to dust along with the crops. The whole simmering conflict finally boils over in a public showdown on a mountaintop. And here the humiliation stops being subtle and gets openly theatrical. The prophet proposes a straightforward contest. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices, and each side calls on its god to answer with fire from heaven. Fairest possible terms. The storm god's several hundred prophets go first, and they call, and they shout, and they work themselves into a desperate frenzy, going to increasingly extreme lengths to rouse their deity for hours on end, and the sky stays stubbornly empty. And the lone prophet, watching this, cannot resist. He heckles them. He suggests with magnificent dryness that maybe their god is lost in thought, or busy, or off on a journey, or perhaps simply asleep and needs a louder wake-up call. The ancient equivalent of asking whether they have tried turning him off and on again, it is one of the great pieces of deadpan mockery in the entire collection. and it is aimed with surgical precision at a God who is supposedly right there and supposedly all-powerful and is currently doing absolutely nothing. Then the prophet soaks his own altar in water until it is practically a pond, calls once on his God, and fire falls and consumes everything, water and all. And to seal the point beyond any argument, the rain, the very thing the storm god had spent years failing to deliver, returns at last, arriving at the word of the God who had withheld it, not the God whose job it was supposed to be. It was never a story about weather. It was a duel over who actually holds the sky, settled in front of a very large and very convinced audience. The final example is the quietest on the surface, and for that reason the most unsettling, because it starts with the most boring administrative act imaginable and ends with a glimpse of something enormous standing just outside ordinary sight. A famous king decides to take a census of his fighting men. On its face, this is pure bureaucracy, the kind of thing that would put a modern reader to sleep faster than any genealogy, a leader simply counting his soldiers. And yet the text treats this head count as a grave sin, one so serious that it triggers a devastating plague, which naturally raises the question no casual reader stops to ask, what on earth is wrong with counting your own army? The answer lives in the motive underneath the arithmetic. Numbering the troops was, in this case, an act of pride and self-reliance, a king measuring his own strength and quietly trusting in the size of his military, rather than in the God who had given him every victory he had ever won. It was a spiritual shift disguised as a spreadsheet, confidence sliding from the invisible source of his power to the visible tally of his forces. And the text is genuinely, fascinatingly tangled about who prompted it. One account frames the impulse as coming from divine anger. Another names an accusing adversary as the instigator. And readers have argued about how to square those two descriptions for a very long time. I am not going to pretend there is a tidy resolution because there is not. But the disagreement itself is a clue, a sign that the writers understood this event to have a hidden instigator, an unseen hand nudging the king toward the fatal head count. Once the king realizes what he has done, he is offered a genuinely grim menu, invited to choose the form his consequence will take from a short list of terrible options, each one a different flavor of national suffering stretched over a different span of time. And his answer is quietly revealing. He refuses to be handed over to human enemies and instead chooses to fall into the hands of God directly, on the stated reasoning that the mercy of heaven runs deeper than the mercy of people, which even in the middle of a catastrophe is a strikingly hopeful thing to bet on. It is a decision that only makes sense if the king believes the invisible power behind the whole ordeal is not merely a force of raw judgment, but something capable of restraint and compassion. He would rather take his chances with the being wielding the sword than with any human court. And the rest of the scene proves he read that being correctly. What follows makes the invisible dimension impossible to ignore. A plague sweeps the land and tens of thousands die. And then the king lifts his eyes and sees the thing behind the disaster. He sees a towering figure, a messenger of judgment, standing suspended between the earth and the sky with a drawn sword stretched out over the city, poised to strike. Sit with that image for a moment because it is one of the rare occasions where the curtain is pulled all the way back. This is not a metaphor about a bad week. It is a colossal being planted between heaven and earth, its blade hanging over the whole population. The visible cause of a plague that had until that instant looked like nothing more than a terrible outbreak of illness. The head count was the surface. This was what had been going on underneath it the entire time. The king, horrified, is told to build an altar on a particular threshing floor, a humble spot where a local man was busy separating his grain. When the owner offers to donate the land and the animals for free, the king flatly refuses, insisting on paying full price, because he will not offer to God something that costs him nothing, which is one of the more quietly convicting lines in the whole book. He buys the place, builds the altar, offers the sacrifice, and the plague stops. The sword, mid-swing over the city, is stayed. And then comes the detail that turns the whole grim episode into a hinge point of history, the kind of thing that makes you sit up. That ordinary threshing floor, the patch of dirt where a plague was halted and a giant sword was sheathed, is the exact spot where the great central temple would later be built. The place where mercy interrupted judgment becomes the permanent address of worship and sacrifice for the entire nation, a location chosen not for its convenience, but for what happened there when the unseen war briefly became visible. Line the three scenes up and the shared lesson is unmistakable. A river of disasters, a multi-year drought, a plague born from a census, and in every single case, the event we can see with our eyes turns out to be the exposed tip of a conflict we mostly cannot. Behind the weather, a duel of gods. Behind the head count, an accuser and a drawn sword. The writers are relentlessly consistent about this. The physical world is the thin, visible skin stretched over a contest of powers, and the biggest events in the story keep leaking evidence of that hidden struggle, whether the human characters notice it or not. Which means the atmosphere of these stories, the part we usually treat as mere scenery, is not scenery at all. It is a whole second narrative running underneath the first, and it has been playing this entire time just past the edge of the frame. We have been decoding what is hidden in the words and hidden by the centuries, and now hidden behind the very surface of reality itself. And believe me, we have barely scratched what the crossbeams of this story are hiding. That word, crossbeams, was not chosen at random, because the deeper you travel into this collection, the more you start to notice that an enormous number of its scenes seem to be quietly leaning in the same direction, like iron filings all pointing at a magnet you cannot yet see. Long before the events everyone thinks of as the main story, the earlier books keep staging little moments that, in hindsight, look uncannily like rehearsals. A prop here, a gesture there, a strange law that seems oddly specific until centuries later when something snaps it into place. Christian readers have a name for this pattern. They call it foreshadowing, or types. The idea that certain older stories function as rough pencil sketches for a picture that only gets painted at the very end. Now, I want to be upfront about what kind of claim this is because honesty has served us well so far. This is a reading done looking backward. Nobody is suggesting the original writers of these ancient stories sat down thinking they were composing riddles about a future execution. That would be a very hard thing to prove and an easy thing to overstate. What the tradition claims is subtler, that the same author was, in its view, sketching the same idea again and again across 1,000 years, so that when the final scene arrives, the earlier ones suddenly rhyme with it. You can take that as deliberate design or as the human habit of finding patterns after the fact. Either way, the rhymes themselves are real and worth looking at, and a few of them are so specific they are genuinely hard to shrug off. Let us walk through the sketches. Start with a scene so tense that people tend to argue about it rather than examine it. The one where an old man is asked to take his long-awaited son up a mountain and give him up. We already brushed against this mountain in passing, because it turns out to be the very same ridge where a plague was once halted and a great sword was sheathed, the patch of high ground that would eventually become the address of the central temple. So the location alone is doing quiet work, stacking 3 enormous moments on one spot across the centuries. But the details of this earlier scene are where it gets pointed. The father is told to bring wood for the offering, and rather than carrying it himself, he loads the bundle of wood onto the back of his own son, who hauls it up the slope on his shoulders. A son climbing a hill, carrying on his own back the wood on which he is supposed to die. If that image rings a distant bell, you are not imagining it, and neither were the early readers who noticed the same thing. There's a timing detail here too that rewards attention. The mountain was not next door. The journey to it took 3 days of walking, 3 full days in which the father carried the sentence in his head, knowing exactly what waited at the end of the road, which is a particular kind of quiet agony that the text does not dwell on but clearly expects you to feel. And the son was almost certainly not the small toddler the storybook illustrations tend to show. He was old enough and strong enough to haul a load of firewood up a mountainside, which means he was also old enough and strong enough to have run or to have simply refused had he chosen to. He does neither. He carries the wood up the hill and lets himself be laid on the altar without a struggle, a detail the tradition finds every bit as loaded as the wood itself, since a willing offering is a very different thing from a helpless one. Then there is the exchange on the way up, which is one of the quietly devastating conversations in the whole book. The boy, not unreasonably, points out that they have the fire and the wood and everything they need for an offering, but they appear to be missing the single most important ingredient, namely the animal. And the father answers that God himself will provide the offering. He says it, one assumes, as a desperate act of faith rather than a confident prediction, the sort of thing you say when you have absolutely nothing else to say. And at the last possible second, when the whole thing is about to become unthinkable, a ram turns up, tangled by its horns in a nearby thicket, and takes the son's place on the altar. A substitute, caught and offered so that the son goes free. The father named that place something like "the Lord will provide," and the tradition reads the whole episode as a first faint sketch of a much later moment on that same mountain range, where a father provides an offering and a son is spared, except that in the sketch, the son walks back down the hill. It is the rough draft with the ending changed, and it is sitting right there at the front of the book. The next sketch is drawn in blood on a doorframe. On the night an enslaved people finally walk free, they are told to take a spotless lamb, one without a single flaw, and to smear its blood on the frame around their doors, so that when death passes through the land in the final plague, it will see the blood and pass over that house, leaving everyone inside untouched. The blood of an innocent standing in for the lives it shelters is already a loud enough echo. But there is a smaller instruction tucked into the rules for that lamb that most people never even register, and it is the detail that later readers found almost impossible to explain away. The law specifies, oddly and emphatically, that not a single bone of the lamb is to be broken. You may eat it, you may roast it, but you may not so much as crack one of its bones. It is a peculiar rule to include, the kind of thing that sits in the text for centuries looking like a random bit of ceremonial fussiness. The lamb itself came with its own oddly specific procedure that later readers found suggestive. It was not simply grabbed from the flock at the last minute. It had to be selected several days in advance and kept, watched, and examined to confirm it carried no defect or blemish whatsoever. A small public inspection to certify the animal was flawless before it could be offered. Centuries later, the tradition points out, the central figure spent his final days being examined too, questioned and cross-examined by one authority after another, each of whom kept arriving at the same verdict that they could find no fault in him. The flawless lamb, inspected and declared without blemish before being offered, gets read as a preview of a man inspected and declared faultless before the same fate. It is the sort of parallel that either strikes you as designed or strikes you as a community reading its own history with a very particular lens, but the specificity is undeniably there. And then, a very long time later, comes the scene it seems to have been waiting for. During an execution by the standard, brutal method of the day, it was routine for the soldiers to hasten death by breaking the legs of the condemned. They do exactly that to the two men on either side. But when they come to the central figure, they find him already gone, and so, entirely for practical reasons and with no idea they're doing anything symbolic, they skip the leg breaking. The writer who records this stops to point out that an ancient rule had just been kept without anyone intending to keep it, the rule that no bone of the lamb should be broken. A piece of ceremonial fine print from 1,000 years earlier gets fulfilled by a couple of soldiers making an offhand logistical call on a busy afternoon. Whatever you make of the theology, that is a remarkably tight piece of storytelling stretched across an enormous gap of time. The third sketch is the strangest of the set because it uses the last symbol you would ever expect for a cure. During the long desert wandering, the people are afflicted by venomous snakes, and the remedy they are given is almost aggressively counterintuitive. A bronze serpent is made and lifted up high on a pole, and anyone who has been bitten simply has to look at it to be healed, which raises an obvious question that the text does not bother to answer. Why on earth would the cure for snakebite be an image of the very thing that is killing you? Staring at a bronze replica of your problem is not, on the face of it, a medical strategy anyone would sign off on. And yet looking is the whole treatment. The bitten person does nothing but turn their eyes toward the lifted up thing and lives. This one we do not even have to interpret on our own because the later teacher picks it up himself and draws the line directly. He compares his own lifting up to that bronze serpent raised on the pole, framing it as the same pattern. Something is lifted up in plain view, and everyone who simply turns and looks at it in trust is rescued from the poison already in their veins. It is one of the rare cases where the connection is not scholars reaching backward, but the central figure of the story reaching backward himself, grabbing an old and bizarre desert episode and saying, essentially, that was about this. The symbol of the curse, lifted up, becomes the means of the cure, which is a paradox the tradition finds enormously meaningful, and which, at minimum, is a very deliberate callback. There is a grim little coda to the bronze serpent that almost nobody knows and that carries a lesson of its own. That very object, the pole and its bronze snake, was apparently kept and preserved for centuries afterward, and over time the people did the entirely predictable human thing and started worshiping the object itself, burning incense to a lump of metal instead of remembering what it had once pointed them toward. Eventually, a reforming king had to smash it to pieces precisely because it had curdled from a symbol of rescue into an idol, a cautionary tale about the way people will happily worship the pointer and forget the thing it was pointing at. The cure had become a snare, which is a very human way for a good thing to go wrong, and a quiet warning tucked into the footnotes about mistaking the sign for the substance. The last of these object and event sketches is the one about the reluctant prophet and the very large fish, and it is worth handling carefully because people usually reduce it to a children's cartoon about a man having a bad day inside a sea creature. Look at the language of the prayer he offers from inside the fish, and something more unsettling emerges. He describes himself as crying out from the belly of the grave, sinking down to the roots of the mountains, with the bars of the earth closing behind him forever, the water pressing over his very soul. That is not the vocabulary of a man who is merely uncomfortable and slightly damp. That is the vocabulary of someone describing death itself, of a person who understood himself to have gone down into the realm of the dead and then been hauled back out. Whether you read it as literal death or as poetic near death, the prophet clearly frames his 3 days in the deep as a kind of dying and returning. And once again, we are not left to guess at the connection, because the later teacher makes it explicit, and even calls it the one sign he will give. He points back to those 3 days the prophet spent in the belly of the fish, and lines them up 1 to 1 against the 3 days he says he will spend in the heart of the earth before returning. He hands the crowd a stubborn old fish story and repurposes it as a preview of a burial and a coming back. 3 days down, then up again, sketched out centuries in advance by a man who mostly just wanted to be left alone and not sent to preach to a city he disliked. Line these 4 up, and a single picture assembles itself out of the fragments. A son carrying wood up the sacrificial mountain. A spotless lamb whose blood shelters and whose bones stay unbroken. A cursed thing lifted up so that all who look are healed. A 3-day descent into death and a return. 4 separate stories from 4 different corners of the collection, written across an immense span of time, and every one of them reads like a study for the same final canvas. The tradition treats the entire older half of the book as a kind of artist's gallery hung with preliminary sketches, all of them circling one subject the painter had apparently been working toward the whole time. You do not have to accept the theology to feel the eerie coherence of it, the sense of a long design revealing itself only when you stand back far enough to see all the drafts at once. But the sketches are not only made of objects and events, some of them are made of entire human beings, whole lives lived out as unwitting previews. And that is where this gets even more interesting, because it means the story was apparently willing to use real, flawed, complicated people as its drafting paper. The tradition points to several figures whose biographies in retrospect seem to trace the same outline as the central character, sometimes in ways they could not possibly have understood while living them. None of them, it is safe to say, woke up in the morning thinking of themselves as a rough draft of anybody, which is probably for the best, as that is a lot of pressure to put on a person before breakfast. The first and perhaps oddest is a mysterious king who wanders into the story for exactly 3 verses and then vanishes without a trace. He rules a city whose name is tied to the word for peace, and he is described as both a king and a priest at once, which was almost unheard of since those 2 roles were normally kept strictly separate. When a weary war hero passes through, this king comes out to meet him carrying bread and wine, blesses him, and receives a tithe in return, and then he is simply gone from the narrative. What makes him strange to later readers is what the text does not say about him. There is no mention of his parents, no genealogy, no record of his birth, and no record of his death, which in a book absolutely obsessed with tracing family lines, as we have seen at length, is a conspicuous silence. He appears to have neither beginning nor end on the page. A much later song picks him up and declares that a coming ruler will be a priest forever in the pattern of this shadowy king, and a still later letter builds an entire argument on him, seizing on that lack of recorded birth or death to cast him as an image of a priesthood that never expires. The bread and the wine he carried out, the fusion of king and priest in one person, the city of peace, the priesthood without an end date, All of it gets read as a preview of a figure who would combine the same offices and share the same bread and wine with his followers. Not bad for a man who occupies less space than a modern grocery receipt. The later letter that builds on him presses one more detail that is easy to miss but rather clever. When the war hero handed over a tenth of his spoils to this mysterious king, he was, by the logic of that culture, acknowledging the king as his superior, since the lesser figure pays honor to the greater. And because that war hero was the ancestor of the entire later priestly line, the argument runs that the whole official priesthood, still generations away from being born, in a sense paid its respects through him to this earlier, higher kind of priest. It is a genealogical sleight of hand, but a striking one. The priesthood everyone knew was being quietly ranked beneath a priesthood that had shown up centuries before it and left no family tree at all. The point being built, brick by careful brick, is that the pattern of this vanishing king outranks the entire system that came after him. The next preview is a love story, which is a nice change of pace, and it hinges on a piece of ancient family law that has no modern equivalent. In that society, if a family fell into poverty or lost its land or its men, a close relative had the right, and in some cases the duty, to step in and buy everything back, to redeem the destitute relatives and restore what they had lost. This rescuer relative had a specific title, the Redeemer, and the whole institution existed to keep families from vanishing into debt and slavery. A destitute widow and her equally destitute foreign daughter-in-law find themselves at the mercy of exactly this system, and a wealthy landowner turns out to be the relative with both the right and the willingness to redeem them. He buys back the family land, marries the foreign woman, and restores a broken household from the edge of extinction, paying the full price himself to lift up people who had nothing left to offer. The story even builds in a moment of genuine suspense on this front, because it turns out there was another relative first in line, a nearer kinsman with the prior right to redeem. When this closer relative learns that redeeming the land also means taking on the foreign widow and reviving the dead man's family line, he balks, worried it will complicate his own inheritance, and he formally steps aside. Only then does the willing landowner take up the role, choosing to shoulder the very obligation the other man refused because it cost too much. The redeemer who counts the cost and walks away, followed by the redeemer who counts the same cost and pays it anyway, is a contrast the tradition reads as pointing straight at the difference between what the law could not manage and what a willing redeemer would. The rescue happens precisely because someone was prepared to accept the expensive version. The tradition reads him as a clean and deliberate sketch of a redeemer who pays the price to buy back those who cannot buy themselves back. And there is a bonus detail that makes it land even harder. The foreign woman, an outsider from a people her new nation generally regarded with suspicion, does not just get rescued. She gets grafted directly into the family line that runs down through the generations to the central figure himself. An outsider redeemed at a relative's expense ends up as a great-grandmother in the most important genealogy in the book, which is the kind of plot decision that tells you exactly how this story feels about outsiders. That same theme, an outsider marked for rescue, drives a shorter and grittier episode set during the fall of a fortified city. Before the walls come down, two scouts slip into the city and are hidden by a local woman of, let us say, a colorful profession and low social standing. In exchange for her protection, she is given a single instruction to guarantee her survival. Tie a length of scarlet cord in her window, and when the city is destroyed, everyone inside that marked house will be spared. So a crimson cord hangs in a window while judgment sweeps through everything around it, and the household behind the red marker lives. The color's not subtle, and neither is the function, a crimson sign that turns aside destruction and shelters everyone gathered under it, echoing that blood on the doorframes we just looked at. And this woman, too, an outsider with a reputation that would have gotten her excluded from polite company, ends up woven into the same family line as the Redeemer and his foreign bride, which by now is starting to look less like coincidence and more like a policy. In fact, the thread pulls even tighter than it first appears because this rescued outsider with the crimson cord turns out to be an ancestor of the very Redeemer from the love story we just walked through, which makes the scarlet cord woman and the redeemed foreign bride two links in a single chain leading down to the central figure. Two outsiders, both women the respectable world would have kept at arm's length, both spared and lifted up, both stitched into the same bloodline within a generation or two of each other. If the story were trying to make a point about exactly who gets written into its most important family tree, it could hardly have been less subtle about it. The last of these human sketches is the one that requires the most rethinking because the popular version has him all wrong. Most people remember him as a muscle-bound hero, the strongest man who ever lived, a sort of ancient action figure with great hair. What the text actually gives us is far more tragic and far more interesting. He was set apart from birth under a strict lifelong vow, a special dedication that came with a short list of rules. No wine or anything from the grapevine, no contact with dead bodies, and no cutting of his hair. And over the course of his life, he breaks nearly every one of them with cheerful disregard. He scoops honey out of the rotting carcass of a lion, which handles the corpse rule. He throws exactly the kind of drinking feast his vow was supposed to rule out. He chases his appetites from one bad decision to the next, treating his sacred calling as a set of guidelines rather than requirements. The only vow he manages to keep, more by accident than by discipline, is the one about the hair, and eventually, thanks to a spectacularly ill-advised relationship, he loses even that. It is worth being clear about what the hair actually represented because the popular version treats it like a magic battery, as though the strength lived in the follicles and a haircut simply unplugged him. The hair was never the source. It was the last visible sign of a dedication he had otherwise abandoned in every other respect. The final outward token of a calling he had treated carelessly for years. When it went, what he truly lost was not a power source, but the last remnant of the set-apart life he had been given and squandered, and the strength that had rested on that dedication departed with it. The tragedy is not that someone cut his hair. The tragedy is that a man given an extraordinary purpose spent nearly all of it chasing his own appetites until only one thread of the original vow was left, and then that went too. He is, in short, a deeply flawed deliverer, a rescuer who spent most of his career rescuing very little and indulging quite a lot. And yet here is the turn that the tradition finds so striking. At the very end, brought low and stripped of everything, in his final act he accomplishes more than he ever managed in all his years of strength, defeating more of the enemy in his death than in the whole of his life. His victory comes not through his power, but through his dying. A flawed, compromised, self-sabotaging man whose single greatest triumph is achieved in the moment of his own death, which the tradition reads as a shadow, however imperfect, of a victory won the same way. The point the storyteller seemed to be making is almost reckless in its generosity. Even a broken hero who got nearly everything wrong could still be pressed into service as a sketch for the one story the book keeps drawing. If the pattern can run through a man like that, apparently it can run through anyone. Pull the human sketches together with the earlier ones, and the claim sharpens into something bold. The tradition is arguing that the gospel, in its view, was being quietly written into biographies and objects and laws for 1,000 years before the central figure was ever born, drafted over and over in the lives of kings and widows and outsiders and even outright failures. Whether you read that as deliberate design threaded through history or as a community finding meaningful rhymes in its own past, the sheer density of the pattern is hard to look away from once you have seen it. And it sets up a nice irony for where we are going next, because if the older half of the book is full of previews of the main character, the half that finally shows him has a habit of burying his most astonishing moments in the footnotes. Because here is a thing almost nobody notices about the miracle stories. The big, famous ones are so loud that they drown out smaller wonders sitting right beside them in the same sentence. We remember the headline act and completely miss the second miracle hiding in the stage directions. Once you slow down and actually read at the speed the text is moving, these overlooked marvels start jumping out everywhere, and they are frequently stranger than the famous ones they are standing next to. Take the celebrated scene where the teacher walks across the surface of a stormy lake toward his terrified followers in their boat. That is the miracle everyone talks about, understandably, since strolling on open water in the middle of a storm is a tough act to upstage. But watch what happens in the very next breath, the part that gets read right over. The moment he climbs into the boat, the text says the boat is instantly at the shore they had been rowing toward. Not sails a bit faster, not the storm conveniently dies down and they make good time. Immediately at the destination, as though someone hit a fast-forward button on the entire journey. That is a completely separate miracle, a collapsing of distance and time, and it is tucked into a subordinate clause at the end of a sentence like an afterthought. The headline was "The Man on the Water." The buried lead was the boat teleporting to the far shore, which nobody ever seems to mention because the first trick was busy hogging the spotlight. The setup makes the buried miracle even more pointed once you picture it. By the account, the followers had already rowed a fair distance out onto the lake, several miles of hard labor into the dark, straining against a headwind that was actively pushing them back. The kind of night where every stroke earns you almost nothing. They were tired, soaked, and nowhere near where they wanted to be. So when the boat is suddenly at the destination the instant the teacher steps aboard, the contrast could not be sharper. Hours of exhausting, wind-battered rowing that got them halfway, undone, and completed in a single moment. It is the difference between crawling and simply arriving, and the storyteller drops it in without fanfare, apparently trusting the reader to notice that the hard part just got skipped entirely. That same category of wonder, distance simply ceasing to be an obstacle, shows up in an even blunter form in the story of an official who is helping to explain a difficult passage to a foreign dignitary, traveling home along a desert road. After the encounter reaches its natural conclusion and the traveler is sent on his way, rejoicing, the text reports with almost comic casualness that the Spirit of the Lord snatched the helper away, and the dignitary saw him no more, and the man was next found in a town a considerable distance off, already busy preaching in the next place. One moment he is standing by a desert road, the next he is reported to be tens of kilometers away, and the narrator moves on without so much as a raised eyebrow, as if being supernaturally relocated across the countryside were a normal Tuesday commute. It is one of the most matter-of-fact descriptions of a genuinely astonishing event you will find anywhere, delivered in the tone you might use to say someone caught the next bus. And the relocation was not a pointless magic trick either, which is part of why it reads so casually. The traveler he had been helping was a high foreign official heading home to a distant land, carrying with him what he had just learned, so that encounter had effectively planted a seed on an entire other continent. And the helper, dropped down in a coastal town far away, does not stand around marveling at his own commute. He immediately gets back to work, moving from town to town up the coast and preaching in each one until he reaches a larger city. The supernatural shortcut, in other words, deposited him precisely where the next stretch of work was waiting, which suggests the point of the wonder was less the spectacle and more the efficient redeployment of a very busy man. The same understated treatment gets handed to an older prophet at the tail end of a story we visited earlier. The great showdown on the mountain where the long drought finally broke. Once the rain returns and a certain king climbs into his chariot to race back to the royal city ahead of the coming downpour, something unusual comes over the prophet. A power described as the hand of the Lord settles on him, and he tucks up his cloak and simply runs, on foot, and he outruns the chariot the whole way to the city, a distance of somewhere around a marathon. Now, let us be clear about the matchup here because it is genuinely absurd. On one side, a horse-drawn war chariot, the fastest ground transportation the ancient world had to offer with a head start. On the other side, a middle-aged man on foot who had already had, by any measure, an extremely long and eventful day. And the man on foot wins, arriving first after a distance that would flatten most modern athletes with fresh legs and good shoes. It is a feat of supernatural speed and endurance, and it gets exactly one verse, parked at the end of a chapter as though the storyteller were simply tidying up before moving on. What makes it quietly absurd is the timing. This was not a fresh runner on a cool morning. The man had just come off one of the longest and most draining days of his entire life, an all-day public confrontation that would have left anyone flattened, and only then, with nothing left in the tank by any normal reckoning, does he tuck up his cloak and outrun a chariot across a marathon of open country. It is the ancient equivalent of finishing a full day of the hardest work imaginable, and then, as a kind of encore, beating a car home on foot. The storyteller mentions it and moves on, apparently confident that after everything else in the chapter, a man outrunning a war chariot barely rates a second glance. The most layered of these overlooked wonders, though, involves a woman in a crowd, and it rewards slow reading more than almost anything else in the book. She had suffered from a chronic bleeding condition for 12 long years, which was miserable enough on its own, but in that culture it carried a second, crueler weight. Under the purity laws of the day, her condition rendered her ritually unclean, and not just her. By the rules, anything and anyone she touched became unclean as well, which meant she had spent over a decade as a walking source of contamination, cut off from normal contact, unable to move through a crowd without technically defiling everyone she brushed against. She was, in the eyes of the law, the last person who should have been shoving her way through a packed street toward a holy man. And yet that is exactly what she does, and the detail of what she reaches for is the key that unlocks the whole scene. She does not grab his arm or his shoulder. She reaches specifically for the edge of his garment, and that edge is not a random hem. Devout men of the period wore tassels on the corners of their outer garment, knotted cords required by an old command as a physical reminder of the sacred instructions. Those tassels sat on the corners, and the word for that corner in the original language is the same word used for a wing. The corner of the garment and the wing of a bird are, linguistically, the same thing. So already there is a poetry hiding in her reach. She is grabbing for the wing of his robe. Now stack one more piece on top. An old prophetic promise had spoken of a coming figure described as a rising sun of righteousness, and it declared that there would be healing in his wings, using that very same word, healing in his wings. And here is a desperate woman reaching through a crowd for the wing of the one many believed to be that promised figure, grasping at precisely the place the ancient promise had said healing would be found. Whether or not she knew the wordplay, her instinct aimed her straight at it. And then comes the reversal that turns the whole thing inside out. By every rule she had lived under for 12 years, her touch should have transferred her uncleanness to him, contaminating the holy man the instant she made contact. Instead, the flow runs the other way entirely. His purity does not recede from her contamination, it overwhelms it. Rather than her defiling him, he cleanses her, the wholeness moving outward from him to her in a direction the purity laws had never accounted for. She reached for the wing in faith, and instead of dragging him down into her uncleanness, she was pulled up into his wholeness. All of that, the wings, the ancient promise, the stunning reversal of the purity rules, is packed into a brief episode most readers treat as a warm-up act for a bigger miracle happening in the same chapter. And that is the quiet lesson of all these buried wonders. Scattered through the throwaway lines and the subordinate clauses is evidence of an authority that supposedly stretches over time, over distance, over the physical world, and over the deep rules of purity that governed everything in that culture, and almost all of it is hiding in verses. People read at full speed on their way to the famous parts. The headline miracles get the attention, but the marginalia is where some of the strangest and most specific claims are tucked away, waiting for anyone patient enough to actually slow down. Which is really the whole invitation of tonight. Read the small print, linger on the boring verse, and notice the wing at the corner of the robe. Because the more carefully you look at any of it, the more you find hiding just underneath. And we still have a good deal of hiding left to uncover, which is the perfect place to pick the thread back up, because that little trick with the word for wing, one small term quietly carrying two meanings at the same time, was not a fluke. It was a glimpse of something that runs through the entire collection like a watermark you only see when you tilt the page. These documents were written in languages that do not politely line up with ours, and those languages are absolutely stuffed with words that mean two things at once, puns that land beautifully in the original, and then evaporate the instant somebody translates them into plain English. And when a pun evaporates, so does half the joke, half the argument, and occasionally the entire point of the scene. Spare a thought here for translators who have one of the quietly impossible jobs in the world. When a single word in the original is doing double duty, deliberately meaning two things because the author wanted both meanings live at the same time, the translator has to walk up to that word, look it in the eye, and pick one. Just one. The other meaning gets left behind on the cutting room floor, and the reader in the new language never even knows it was there. Most of the time this is unavoidable and nobody suffers. But in a handful of famous passages, the dropped meaning was the load-bearing one, and losing it turns a razor-sharp exchange into something that reads as merely odd, or worse, as the characters being strangely dense. Let us go rescue a few of those lost meanings. Start with a late-night visit from a nervous member of the establishment. A respected religious authority, a man with a reputation to protect, comes to see the teacher, and the text is careful to mention that he comes at night. On the surface, that is just a scheduling note, the ancient equivalent of penciling someone in after hours. But most readers of the story catch the quiet symbolism the writer seems to be planting. A man who lives in the daylight of official respectability, creeping through the dark because he is not yet willing to be seen, a person still very much in the shadows in more than one sense. Keep that detail in your back pocket because it pays off later. Now to the actual trap of the passage, which is a pun so central that the whole conversation collapses into nonsense without it. The teacher tells this man that no one can see the kingdom unless they are born anothen, and that Greek word anothen is the entire hinge of the scene because it genuinely means two different things at the same time. It can mean again, as in a second time, a fresh start, and it can equally mean from above, as in from a higher place, from the realm of God. Both meanings are fully alive in the word, and the teacher, one strongly suspects, means to fire off both barrels at once. But his visitor, hearing the conversation in real time, grabs the first meaning and runs straight off a cliff with it. He hears born again in the most literal, physical sense imaginable, and responds with the famously baffled question about how a grown man could possibly climb back into his mother and be born a second time, which is a mental image nobody in that room needed, and which we will not dwell on further. For centuries, readers who only had the flattened translation have quietly judged this man as a bit slow, wondering how a distinguished scholar could ask something so absurdly literal. But he is not being dense at all. He is being tripped by a pun that the English word again cannot carry, because in English again only means one thing, the do-it-over meaning, while the from-above meaning has been silently deleted in transit. The man latches onto the only sense his ears can process and lands on the biological impossibility, while the teacher is talking about a birth from an entirely different source, a life that comes down from above rather than one that gets redone from scratch. The whole misunderstanding is manufactured entirely by a double meaning, and the moment you know the word carries both, the scene stops being about a slow student and becomes about the vast gap between a fresh start you engineer yourself and a new life handed to you from somewhere higher up. It is worth knowing that this visitor was no minor figure fumbling around out of his depth. He was a member of the ruling council, one of the most educated and respected religious authorities of the entire nation, the sort of man who spent his life interpreting sacred texts for everyone else, which is exactly why the teacher allows himself a mild, pointed jab, essentially asking how the appointed teacher of the whole people could be the one person in the room failing to follow this. The gentle needle only lands if you know the man's rank. It is the equivalent of a professor being politely stumped by a first-day question and being reminded, ever so lightly, that he is supposed to be the one who knows. The great scholar, tripped by a two-sided word, gets a small and affectionate reminder that expertise in the letter is not the same as grasping the thing itself. And the passage is not even done playing this game because a few lines later the teacher reaches for a second word doing the exact same double duty. He starts talking about the wind, how it blows wherever it pleases and you can hear it but cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going, and then compares that to everyone born of the Spirit. Here is the delicious part. The word he uses, pneuma, means both wind and spirit at once, the same way our earlier word meant both again and from above. So he is not just making a poetic comparison between two separate things, the wind and the spirit. He is playing on a single word that is both at the same time, letting the invisible, uncontrollable, unpredictable movement of the breeze become the invisible, uncontrollable, unpredictable movement of the divine, all inside one term. In English, we are forced to use two different words, and the pun quietly dies, leaving us with a nice metaphor instead of the wordplay fireworks the original audience would have caught instantly. And as for our shadow-dwelling visitor, the tradition likes to point out that he shows up twice more in the story, each time a little further into the light, until at the very end he steps fully into the open in broad daylight to help care for the teacher's body. The man who arrived under cover of darkness eventually comes out into the sun, which is a quiet character arc built partly on that opening detail about the hour of his visit. The next lost pun belongs to a very different sort of person, and the contrast is almost certainly deliberate, because the storyteller parks these two encounters right next to each other. Where the last one was a respected male insider who came by night, this one is an outsider woman who comes in the blazing middle of the day, and the collision of those two setups is the whole point. She arrives at a well at the 6th hour, which in their reckoning is high noon, the hottest, most miserable stretch of the day, the time no sensible person hauls a heavy water jar anywhere if they can help it. Everyone else drew their water in the cool of the morning or the evening, and they did it together because the well was the social hub, the place the women of the village gathered to talk. So a woman coming alone at noon is not a scheduling quirk. It is a neon sign that she is avoiding the crowd, or that the crowd is avoiding her. And the reason becomes clear soon enough. She has a complicated marital history involving a string of husbands and a current arrangement that the respectable villagers evidently found scandalous. She comes at noon because noon is when the well is empty, and an empty well is the only kind she can face. The setting sharpens the whole exchange in a way that is easy to miss. This was no ordinary watering hole. It was an ancient, famous well, one the locals proudly traced back to a revered founding ancestor who had supposedly dug it generations earlier, and she pointedly reminds the stranger of that heritage, asking whether he imagines himself greater than the great patriarch who gave them the well. She is, in effect, playing a status card, invoking the deep history of the place against this thirsty out-of-towner with no bucket. And the irony, which the writer clearly relishes, is that yes, the text intends for us to understand that he is in fact greater than the celebrated ancestor, though she has no idea yet. On top of that, the very phrase he chose carried a heavy resonance in their scriptures, where the divine had long been described as the fountain of living water, the true source people kept abandoning in favor of broken tanks that held nothing. So his double meaning was not a clever one-off invention. It was reaching back into a whole tradition of imagery, offering himself as the living source those older texts had promised. She hears buckets and depth. He is quietly claiming to be the spring itself. And into that loaded setup drops the pun. The teacher, resting by the well, offers her what he calls living water. Now, in ordinary everyday speech, living water was a completely mundane term. It simply meant flowing, running water, the fresh stuff bubbling up from a spring or a stream, as opposed to the still, stale, slightly questionable water that sat in a cistern collecting whatever fell into it. So when he offers her living water, the plain surface meaning is almost comically ordinary, roughly equivalent to offering someone bottled spring water instead of what is in the tank. And she hears exactly that mundane meaning, which is why she reasonably points out that he does not even have a bucket, and the well is deep, so where exactly is this fancy running water supposed to come from? She is being practical. She is answering the everyday sense of the phrase, because that is the only sense she has any reason to expect. But he has loaded the term with a second meaning riding underneath the first, water that is itself alive, a source of life that never runs dry, welling up into something eternal. The entire conversation is the two of them operating on two different floors of the same word, her standing firmly on the literal ground floor discussing buckets and depth, while he keeps gesturing at the upper floor she cannot yet see. It is the same machinery as the night visitor and his womb question, one word split into two meanings, one speaker on each level, and the gap between them is where the whole teaching lives. Put the two scenes side by side as the writer clearly wants us to, and you get a deliberate pairing, the honored teacher in the dark who struggles to grasp it, and the shamed outsider in the glaring light who, by the end of her scene, understands enough to run back and tell her whole town. The insider comes out of the shadows slowly over 3 appearances. The outsider gets there in a single afternoon. The double meaning of one plain word is the engine of both. There is a tiny, easily missed detail at the end of her scene that quietly seals it. When she finally grasps what she has been offered and hurries back toward the town to tell everyone, the text mentions, almost in passing, that she left her water jar behind. She had walked all that way in the punishing midday heat for the express purpose of filling that jar, the entire errand that brought her to the well, and she simply abandons it and runs. It is the sort of small human touch a careful writer plants on purpose. The woman who came for ordinary water forgot all about it the moment she found the other kind, leaving the very thing she had come for sitting in the dust because it suddenly did not matter. And the woman the town had apparently been avoiding becomes the first person to go running back to that same town with news, which is its own quiet reversal of her whole situation. The third lost meaning powers one of the most famous verbal traps in the whole collection, and it is a case where knowing the key word turns a clever dodge into an absolute demolition. The setup is delicious on its own because it features two groups who normally could not stand each other suddenly linking arms for a common cause. On one side are figures loyal to the ruling political establishment, comfortable with the occupying empire and its taxes. On the other are the devout religious purists who resented that same empire and its taxes with a passion. These two camps agreed on almost nothing and generally regarded one another with open contempt, but they were united by a shared desire to trap one troublesome teacher, which goes to show that nothing builds a friendship quite like a mutual target. Together they cook up a question engineered to have no safe answer. They ask him whether it is lawful to pay the imperial tax. And it is a masterpiece of a trap, because either answer detonates. If he says yes, pay it, he alienates the crowds who despise the tax as a badge of their humiliation under foreign rule, and he looks like a collaborator. If he says no, do not pay it, he has just publicly called for tax resistance against the empire, which is the sort of statement that gets a person arrested for sedition before lunch. Yes ruins his reputation, no ruins his neck. They have, they think, boxed him in perfectly, and you can almost picture the two rival delegations exchanging a satisfied glance, briefly united in smugness. He asks to see the coin used for the tax, and someone produces one, and he asks a simple question: whose image is this, and whose inscription? The image, of course, is the emperor's, his face stamped into the metal along with his title. And that title is a quiet little detonation of its own, because the inscription running around the coin did not merely name the emperor, it declared him the son of the divine, effectively a god in metal, complete with high and holy honors, which makes the moment gently awkward for his devout opponents, the ones so scrupulous about purity, because the very fact that they could produce such a coin on request meant they were carrying a small piece of imperial god propaganda around in their own pockets, quite possibly within the sacred precincts, without apparent embarrassment. He asked them to hand him the coin, and in doing so they revealed they had one, which was itself a subtle exposure. The men laying a trap about loyalty to the empire had the empire's blasphemous currency ready to go, and the teacher had them produce it in public before he said a word about it. And that word, image, is the key that unlocks the entire thing, because in the language of these texts, it is the very same word used at the very beginning of the whole story, in the line about human beings being made in the image of God. Same word. The coin bears the emperor's image, so, the teacher says, give back to the emperor what belongs to the emperor. Fair enough, hand the man his own currency, but then comes the second half, hanging unspoken in the air for anyone paying attention. And give to God what bears God's image. And what bears God's image? Not the coin. You do. The human being standing there holding the coin is the thing stamped with the divine likeness, which means the coin can go back to the emperor all day long, a trivial piece of metal, but the person, the image bearer, belongs entirely and only to God. In one move, he has answered both traps and escaped them because he has neither endorsed the empire nor called for rebellion. He has quietly relativized the whole question by pointing out that the emperor can have his little coins while God lays claim to the infinitely more valuable thing, the people themselves. The trap springs backward and catches the trappers, and the crowd, we are told, was amazed and left him alone, which is the ancient way of saying the two rival delegations shuffled off to lick their wounds and possibly reconsider their new partnership. And none of that lands with full force unless you know that the word for the emperor's image on the coin is the exact same word as the divine image on a human face. One term, used twice, turning a political ambush into a statement about who ultimately owns you. The moral of this whole stretch is a small piece of practical advice you can actually use. When a passage in any translated text strikes you as strange, or a character seems weirdly obtuse, or an answer feels like it skips a step, there is a decent chance the original was running on a pun or a double meaning that got flattened on the way to your language. The oddness is often the fingerprint of a lost word. You do not need to learn ancient languages to benefit from this, you just need the habit of pausing at the strange spots and checking what the underlying word actually was. Because more often than you would guess, the confusion dissolves the moment you find the second meaning that the translator, through no fault of their own, had to leave behind. A fair word of caution belongs here, though, because this is a tool that can be badly misused. Not every word is secretly a pun, and not every odd phrase is hiding a lost meaning. The internet is generously stocked with confident people who have discovered profound hidden codes in words that are, on closer inspection, doing nothing unusual at all. The honest version of this skill is not about forcing secret meanings onto the text wherever you would like them to be. It is about recognizing the genuine cases where the original language really was carrying two senses at once, and checking rather than assuming. The double meanings we just walked through are not creative inventions read into the text. They are features actually present in the original words, documented and agreed upon by people who study these languages for a living. The goal is to catch the real ones, not to manufacture new ones, which is a distinction worth keeping firmly in mind before you start finding hidden messages in your breakfast cereal. The words themselves are hiding things, and sometimes the whole scene is waiting inside a single one. But words, it turns out, were not the only medium these messengers worked in. Some of them delivered their most important content without saying anything at all, by turning their own lives and bodies into the message. Because there is a whole category of figures in this tradition, the prophets, who frequently discovered that talking was not getting the job done, and who responded by doing something far stranger and far more memorable. They acted the message out, physically, sometimes for years, turning themselves into living, walking, breathing demonstrations. If the wordplay we just looked at is the message hiding inside language, this is the message escaping language altogether and climbing into a human body. It helps to understand why they resorted to this, because from the outside it looks frankly bizarre. These were people convinced they had been handed an urgent warning or promise for a population that was, to put it gently, not in a listening mood. Words alone bounced off, so they turned to something closer to performance art. Elaborate physical demonstrations designed to be impossible to ignore. The ancient equivalent of a protest so visually strange that everyone stops to stare and, hopefully, to ask what on earth it means. It was communication for an audience that had stopped reading the memos, delivered in the one format nobody could quite tune out. And once you know to look for it, you realize some of the most famous figures in the whole collection were essentially staging the longest-running one-person shows in history. We do have a modern reference point for this, which helps it feel less alien. Think of the protester who chains themselves to something, or the artist who sits silently in a gallery for weeks, or the demonstration so visually strange that it ends up on every screen precisely because nobody can quite look away. The power of those acts is that they bypass argument entirely. You cannot fact-check a person lying in the street. You can only watch and feel something and ask what it means. The prophets understood this instinct thousands of years early. They grasped that a sufficiently strange and committed physical act would burrow into people in a way a well-crafted speech never could, lodging in the memory precisely because it was so odd. The difference is mainly one of duration and stamina, because where a modern demonstration might last an afternoon, these performances often ran for months or years, which is a level of dedication to a message that would exhaust nearly anyone. Take the wild-looking figure who shows up to announce the arrival of the main character, the one who lived out by the river and called people to change their lives. Most people file him under eccentric desert preacher and move on, but nearly everything about him was a deliberate, embodied sermon before he ever opened his mouth. His choice to live out in the wilderness rather than in the towns was itself the message, a physical acting out of turning away from a society he considered corrupt, a visible break with business as usual. His clothing of coarse camel hair and his diet of insects and wild honey were not just rustic survivalism. They were a pointed, walking rejection of comfort and status, a man wearing his whole critique of soft, compromised living directly on his body, which cannot have smelled great but certainly made the point. He even seems to have deliberately dressed to echo a famous fiery prophet of centuries past, the one with the hairy garment and the leather belt, signaling to anyone who knew their history that he stood in that same tradition before he said a single word. He even described his own role in borrowed language, calling himself a voice crying out in the wilderness, which was itself lifted straight from an old prophetic text about someone preparing a road through the desert for the arrival of God. So his very choice of address, out in the empty country rather than on a city street corner, was not just practical. It turned an ancient line about a wilderness herald into a physical fact, with him standing in the actual wilderness, fulfilling the actual geography of the prophecy. The location was part of the costume, the setting was part of the sermon, and a centuries-old promise about a desert voice was being embodied by a man who had gone and made himself, quite literally, a desert voice. And for all the attention his strange appearance drew, the entire performance was designed to point away from himself. He was insistent, almost stubbornly so, that he was not the main event, but merely the opening act, the one clearing the road for someone far greater who was coming right behind him. He compared himself to a servant not even worthy to handle the sandals of the one to follow, and described his own role as necessarily shrinking so that the other could grow. It is an unusual thing to build an entire memorable public persona precisely in order to redirect everyone's gaze to somebody else, a bit like a warm-up act whose whole job is to get the crowd looking at the wings for the real performer. The living sermon was, in the end, a signpost, and a signpost that keeps loudly reminding you it is not the destination. And the central act he became known for, the ritual washing in the river, was the sermon made physical and participatory. To take part, a person could not just nod along from the comfort of their home. They had to physically get up, leave the town, and walk out into the wilderness to reach him, which meant the very act of coming to him was already a small enactment of the thing he was preaching, leaving the old life behind and going out to start over. Then they were dunked under the water and brought back up, a bodily picture of being washed clean and beginning again that required no explanation because everyone could feel exactly what it meant. He turned an abstract idea about changing your ways into a physical journey and a physical act, so that people did not just hear about starting fresh, they walked out of their old lives and did it with their whole bodies. The man was a message you had to participate in. If that seems intense, it is nothing compared to the assignment handed to an earlier prophet, which may be the single most demanding piece of live theater in the entire book, and also one of the most painful. This man was instructed to marry a woman who would be unfaithful to him, to love her anyway, and to keep taking her back even after she wandered off, because his entire marriage was meant to be a living, aching demonstration of the relationship between the divine and a people who kept straying. His personal heartbreak was the medium. Every time his wife left and he went and brought her back at real cost to himself, he was physically acting out a faithfulness that refuses to quit even when it is not returned. And the whole nation was meant to watch this domestic drama unfold and see their own behavior reflected back at them. It is a staggering thing to ask of a person, essentially turning a man's most private pain into a public billboard, and the text does not pretend it was anything less than agonizing. And then, because subtlety was apparently not on the menu, the couple's children got dragged into the performance too, handed names that were themselves entire sermons. One child was given a name meaning something close to no more compassion, and another a name meaning not my people, so that the prophet could not so much as call his kids in for dinner without broadcasting the message to the whole neighborhood. Imagine the logistics of that at any social gathering, introducing your children by names that announce a coming judgment on the nation. The entire family had been conscripted into the demonstration, a household turned into a walking, talking prophecy where even the roll call was a warning. But the story does not end in judgment because the prophet is later told to go and buy his wandering wife back, to redeem her from the low place she had ended up in and restore her, which turns the whole grim performance around into a picture of a love that pays to reclaim what it lost. And in a detail that completes the arc beautifully, those crushing children's names get reversed at the end. The very names that had functioned as walking announcements of rejection are later flipped into their opposites, so that not my people becomes, in a stroke, my people, and no more compassion becomes an object of compassion after all. The same kids who had been living billboards of judgment are recast as living billboards of restoration, their names rewritten from a verdict into a welcome. It is the entire message in miniature. The naming that began as a warning ends as a homecoming, and the family that had been conscripted to announce the breach is conscripted again to announce the mending. Even the roll call, in the end, changed its tune. The lived drama carries a message that no lecture ever could, precisely because everyone could see it cost the man something real. Others in this line went to physical extremes that make the modern mind wince a little on their behalf. One major prophet was instructed to go about stripped of his outer clothing and barefoot for a long stretch of time, walking around in a state of public undress as a living sign of the humiliation and exposure that a coming military defeat would bring. A walking preview of captives being led away with nothing. The text is a bit spare on the details, and scholars generally think this meant stripped down to a minimal undergarment rather than entirely bare, which at least spares us the more extreme mental picture. But either way, it was a deeply humbling thing to do in public for years, deliberately making a spectacle of himself so that people would viscerally feel what was coming rather than just hear about it. He wore the nation's future disgrace on his own body, which is a level of commitment to a metaphor that most communicators, thankfully for everyone, never reach. There was a sharp political point underneath that particular act which makes it more than mere shock value. His own people were being tempted to pin their hopes for safety on an alliance with a nearby foreign power, betting that this strong neighbor would protect them from an approaching threat. His long, uncomfortable demonstration of walking about stripped and barefoot was a preview aimed squarely at that gamble. The very ally they were counting on, he was signaling, would itself be defeated and led away in exactly that condition, exposed and humiliated, its captives marched off with nothing. In other words, the protection they were about to trust would end up in the same disgrace he was acting out on his own body. It was a foreign policy warning delivered without a single position paper. Just a man making himself a walking image of where their misplaced confidence would lead. Uncomfortable, yes, but considerably harder to ignore than a strongly worded scroll. The most elaborately staged of all these performances belongs to another prophet who essentially built a diorama and then became part of it. He was told to take a clay brick, sketch a city onto it, and then construct a miniature model siege around it, complete with little ramps and camps and battering rams, playing out an entire military blockade in miniature like the world's grimmest tabletop game. And then, not content with the model, he was told to lie down on his side next to it for an astonishing stretch of days, well over a year in total when you add up both sides. One day for each year of the people's wrongdoing, turning his own reclining body into a calendar counting out the weight of their guilt. He lay there day after day after day, a human clock ticking off centuries of accumulated failure beside a toy city under toy attack, which is either the most patient act of devotion imaginable or the least comfortable art installation ever mounted, and quite possibly both. His body became the timeline, his endurance became the argument, and anyone who walked past could see, in the most literal terms, exactly how long and how heavy the reckoning was meant to be. The same prophet had a whole repertoire of these physical demonstrations, and another of them turned his own hair into a chilling little forecast. He was told to shave off his hair and beard, weigh the clippings out carefully, and divide them into 3 equal portions, each of which then met a different fate meant to represent what would happen to the population of a doomed city. 1 part scattered, 1 part struck, 1 part burned. It was a grim piece of visual arithmetic performed on his own head, a demonstration in which the man's grooming became a diagram of a nation's coming division and loss. Only a tiny amount was tucked away and preserved, a small sign of a remnant that would survive. Using his own shaved hair as a props department is not something they teach in communication school, but as a way of making an abstract statistic about a city's fate impossible to forget, it was, one has to admit, extremely effective. It is worth pausing on the sheer personal cost of all this before we draw the thread together, because it is easy to treat these acts as clever communication strategies and forget that actual people had to live inside them. None of these demonstrations was comfortable, and several were genuinely punishing on the person performing them. Years of public humiliation, a marriage built around repeated betrayal, well over a year spent lying on the ground beside a clay model, children saddled with names that broadcast doom every time they were called in for supper. These were not weekend stunts followed by a hot meal and a soft bed. They were long, grinding sacrifices of comfort, dignity, and privacy, absorbed by individuals who apparently believed the message mattered more than their own ease. And that belief is precisely what makes the performances land, then and now, because an audience can always sense the difference between a person striking a pose and a person paying a real price. The cost was the credibility, and the credibility was the entire point. Pull all of these together and a single idea comes into focus, one that reframes how these figures ought to be read. For the prophets, the message and the life were not 2 separate things, a sermon over here and a person over there. They were fused into one. You could not extract the teaching and throw away the man because the man was the teaching, delivered in flesh and time and discomfort and heartbreak rather than merely in words. Their stories resist being read only on the surface, as a transcript of things somebody said, because the saying was often the smallest part. The real communication was in the doing, the wearing, the walking, the waiting, the marrying, the lying down for a year and a half beside a clay brick. To read them as talking heads is to miss almost everything. and that fusion of message and life points somewhere very specific, which is exactly why the tradition lingers on it. All of these figures were, in a sense, warming up the audience for a much larger version of the same idea. Because the central claim the whole collection has been building toward is that its main character did not merely deliver a message and did not merely act one out for a season the way these prophets did, but was the message from beginning to end, a person whose entire existence, every word and silence and gesture and meal and death, was itself the communication. The prophets embodied fragments of it for stretches of time. The claim about the one they were preparing for is that he embodied the whole thing permanently, the living word, the message that stopped being written down and simply walked around. And that is a far bigger door than we have yet opened, which is precisely where all of this has been quietly heading the entire time. If the messengers we just left were turning their own bodies into billboards, there is another writer in this collection who did something adjacent but sneakier. He reached for the most ordinary objects around him and packed them with meaning, trusting his readers to see the real thing behind the picture. The trouble is that the objects he chose were so specific to his own century that we, 20 centuries downstream, have quietly swapped them for the wrong images in our heads. We hear his famous comparisons and picture something vaguely medieval or something off a cereal box, and the whole point softens into a nice abstraction. But his first readers did not picture anything vague at all. They pictured the very real, very intimidating hardware of the soldiers standing on their street corners, because that gear was everywhere, and the writer was almost certainly looking at some of it while he wrote, which is the detail that reorganizes everything. This particular author composed several of his letters while under arrest, quite possibly chained by the wrist to a rotating shift of imperial guards, which is not the writing retreat most authors dream of, but did come with one unusual perk, an extremely up-close research subject. So when he starts describing a suit of spiritual armor piece by piece, he is not inventing a fantasy costume. He is, in all likelihood, glancing over at the actual soldier he is physically attached to and cataloging the man's equipment item by item, turning his own guard into a live diagram. Once you know that, the whole passage stops being a stained glass abstraction and becomes something closer to a prisoner narrating the kit of the person handcuffed to him, which is a considerably more interesting mental picture. There is a gentle irony in that arrangement worth savoring. Here is a man locked up by imperial power, physically tethered to a representative of the very system holding him, and rather than stewing over his captivity, he calmly borrows that captor's own uniform as the illustration for a message about a different kind of strength altogether. The empire chained him to a soldier to keep him contained, and he responded by turning the soldier into a teaching aid, which is either a remarkable feat of finding the silver lining or simply what happens when a writer with nothing but time and a captive research subject gets to work. Either way, the equipment he describes was not a distant memory or a bit of borrowed poetry. It was, quite possibly, rattling faintly on the wrist beside his own as he dictated. Take the piece he mentions first, the belt. To a modern ear, a belt of truth sounds like the least impressive item in the entire outfit, the accessory you add when the real gear is already on, roughly as thrilling as being told your spiritual wardrobe includes sensible shoes. But a soldier's belt in that era was nothing of the sort. It was the thick, central piece that everything else hung from and fastened onto, the anchor that held the tunic gathered up out of the way and gave the other equipment something to attach to. Without it, the whole outfit was loose, flapping, and useless, and a soldier would be tripping over his own clothing the moment he tried to move. So placing truth at that spot is a pointed choice. It is not a decorative add-on, but the thing that holds the entire structure together and keeps everything else from collapsing into a heap. Start with a loose belt, and it does not matter how good the rest of your gear is, you are going to fall over. From that central belt hung the next piece, the body armor covering the chest, which he ties to the idea of doing what is right. This was the large plate or coat of overlapping metal that shielded the torso, and its logic is almost too obvious to need spelling out. It guards the vital organs, the heart, and the lungs, and everything a person cannot survive losing. A blow that got past it was very often the last blow of a soldier's career. Attaching that piece to right living carries a quiet, practical wisdom underneath the metaphor, the observation that a clear conscience protects the core of a person in a fight the way that plate protected the chest, whereas a guilty one leaves a gap right over the heart for an accusation to slip through. It is the difference between going into a confrontation with your center covered and going in with it exposed, and any soldier could have told you which one he preferred. Then there are the sandals, which sound even less heroic until you know what the soldiers actually wore on their feet. The standard military footwear of the period was a heavy, sturdy boot sandal with the underside studded with hobnails, essentially a set of cleats built for the battlefield. The point of all that ironmongery on the sole was traction, the ability to plant your feet and hold your ground on uneven, muddy, or slippery terrain without sliding backward the instant someone shoved you. A soldier whose footing gave way was a soldier about to lose, so the humble boot was quietly one of the most important pieces he owned. Framing readiness as this kind of footwear, then, is not about looking sharp. It is about being unmovable, able to stand firm exactly where you are planted while everything around you tries to knock you off balance. Not the most glamorous item, but the one keeping you upright. And the helmet, which we tend to read past as an obvious safety item, carried its own weight for anyone who had seen combat. The head is the part of you that a single well-aimed blow can end the fight, so the helmet was the difference between a survivable clash and a very short one. Naming it the way he does frames the protected thing as the mind itself, the seat of your resolve, on the reasonable logic that once your head goes, in either the literal or the figurative sense, the rest of you follows quickly. It is a soldier's blunt assessment dressed as a metaphor. Guard the head or the battle is already over. The most illuminating piece of the whole set, though, is the shield, because here the popular mental image is not just vague but actively wrong, and correcting it flips the meaning of the entire line. When most people today hear the word shield, they picture something small and round, the sort of disc a fantasy hero straps to one forearm and twirls around dramatically. That was not the shield this writer had in mind, and it was not the shield his readers pictured either. The standard heavy infantry shield of the period was an enormous rectangular slab, curved slightly to wrap around the body, and tall enough to cover a grown man from shoulder to shin. It was less a piece of arm candy and more a portable wall. One soldier behind one of these was substantially protected. A whole row of them locked together edge to edge became a solid moving barricade, which is precisely how these armies like to fight. But the truly clever part, the detail that makes the metaphor land with a snap, is what these shields were designed to do against a specific and terrifying weapon. Enemies would dip arrows in pitch, set them alight, and rain them down at the start of a battle. And a flaming arrow does not need to pierce you to ruin your day. It just needs to set your gear on fire and send you into a panic. A soldier whose shield suddenly caught flame would instinctively fling it away, and a soldier who throws down his shield has just stripped off his best protection in the middle of the worst possible moment, usually taking a few panicking neighbors down with him as the formation breaks. The solution was as simple as it was ingenious. These large shields were often covered in leather and soaked thoroughly with water before combat, so that when the burning arrows struck, they hit a wet surface and simply hissed out, extinguished on contact, and the soldier held his position instead of bolting. So a shield of faith in this framing is not a passive little guard against the occasional insult. It is the big, soaked, fire-quenching wall that catches the incoming flaming projectiles, snuffs them dead, keeps you from panicking, and lets you stay in formation and even advance behind it. The image is not about defense alone, it is about the thing that stops the chaos from starting, which is a far more muscular idea than a decorative disc. There is one last piece in his inventory, and it stands out because it is the only item on the whole list meant for attack rather than defense, which tells you something about how the passage is weighted. Every other piece protects, this one strikes, and here the specific hardware matters just as much as it did with the shield, because when we hear the word sword, we tend to picture a long, sweeping blade swung in broad arcs, the kind of weapon that needs a lot of room. That was not the standard issue sword of these soldiers. Their blade was short, roughly the length of a forearm, designed not for dramatic slashing, but for tight, precise, close-quarters stabbing. The weapon you used when the enemy was already right in front of you and there was no space to wind up. He calls it the sword of the Spirit and identifies it directly as the Word of God. And the choice of a short, precise blade over a long, wild one is quietly the whole point. This is not about swinging vague spiritual sentiment around in big theatrical arcs. It is about the precise, specific, well-placed word applied exactly where it is needed, which is, not coincidentally, exactly how the central figure himself is later shown handling a spiritual confrontation, answering temptation with short, targeted, specific replies rather than grand speeches. And there is a detail baked into this whole outfit that is easy to miss until you picture the soldiers actually using it, which is that almost none of it was designed for fighting alone. The wall-sized shields worked best locked edge to edge with the shields on either side, the formation depending entirely on every man holding his piece of the line so that the soldier beside him stayed covered. A single warrior in this kit, standing by himself in an open field, was far more vulnerable than the same man in a tight row of his fellows. So the entire image quietly assumes company. The gear is built for people standing shoulder to shoulder, each one's protection partly dependent on the other's holding firm, which turns a passage that sounds like individual spiritual self-improvement into something closer to a description of a unit that only works together. You do not form a shield wall by yourself. That reflex, by the way, the instinct to drop a weapon or a shield at exactly the wrong moment, brings us to a much-argued scene involving actual blades, one that people have been debating for a very long time and that has at least two serious readings worth laying side by side. On the night the central figure is arrested, there is a brief and confusing exchange about swords. Earlier, he had told his followers, somewhat cryptically, that the time had come to be prepared, even suggesting that someone without a sword should go get one, and they respond by reporting that they already have two among them, to which he gives a short reply that scholars still argue about, something to the effect that two is enough, or possibly that is enough of that. And then, later that same night, when the arresting party arrives, one of his more impulsive followers takes one of those swords and swings it, and manages to slice off the ear of a servant in the crowd. And this was not just any random face in the arresting party. The wounded man was a servant of the high priest himself, the single most powerful religious figure in the entire nation, and one of the accounts even preserves his name, which is a level of specific detail the writers usually reserved for people who genuinely mattered. Taking a blade to the personal servant of the high priest on the night of an official arrest in front of an armed detachment was about the most dangerous possible way to lose your temper. It was not a bar brawl with a stranger, it was an assault on a member of the ruling household staff, committed by a known associate of the man they had come to seize. The stakes of that swing were enormous, which is exactly why what happens next is so pointed. One almost has to feel a little sympathy for the follower here, who appears to have swung at a man's head and connected only with an ear, which suggests either a merciful lack of skill or a target who ducked at precisely the right instant. It is not the confident stroke of a trained fighter, it is the flailing of an ordinary person in a panic, reaching for a weapon he barely knew how to use in the worst moment of his life, which arguably makes the whole thing more human and more understandable, and also more in need of the quiet rescue that follows. Here is where two very different interpretations fork, and honestly, both deserve a hearing rather than a verdict. On one reading, the whole business is meant literally and lands as a small legal drama. Swinging a blade at a man's head and taking off his ear is not a warning shot. In practical terms, it is an attempted killing that missed its mark by an inch or two, which under the law of the time was an extremely serious crime that could have gotten the impulsive follower arrested on the spot and dragged into the same fate as his teacher. And what does the teacher do? He reaches out and heals the injured man's ear, restoring it completely. On this reading, that healing is not only an act of mercy toward the wounded servant, it is also, quietly, the removal of the evidence. With the ear made whole and the victim unharmed, there is no longer a mutilated man standing there as living proof of an assault, and the hot-headed follower is no longer facing a capital charge. The teacher, in effect, undoes his friend's worst mistake and erases the crime in the same gesture, which is a strikingly practical kind of grace. He does not stop at the healing either. He tells the impulsive follower in no uncertain terms to put the blade away, adding the memorable warning that those who take up the sword tend to perish by it, a line that reads as both a rebuke and a grim prediction about the whole logic of meeting force with force. So on this reading, the moment carries a double message. The physical undoing of the wound removes the legal danger, and the sharp words that follow reject the entire impulse that caused it. The follower gets both his friend rescued from the consequences and a firm correction for the instinct that created them, which is a lot to pack into the few seconds between a swung blade and a restored ear. On the other reading, favored by a number of serious commentators over the centuries, the talk of swords was never meant to be taken as a literal call to arms at all. but as a vivid figure of speech about the hardship and hostility the followers were about to face, a way of saying that the peaceful days were over and difficult times were coming. Under this view, the two literal blades the followers produce are almost a punchline, a sign that they have completely misunderstood a figurative warning, and the teacher's short reply is less an arms inventory approved and more a weary signal to drop the subject, roughly the tone of a person saying, "Enough, you are missing the point." The later ear-cutting then becomes a demonstration of exactly why the literal reading was a mistake, with the teacher undoing the violence to show that this was never the kind of fight he meant. Both readings have real support, and rather than pretend one obviously wins, it is more honest and more interesting to hold them together as an open question, a place where thoughtful people genuinely disagree about how much of the scene is steel and how much is symbol. It is worth being clear about which parts of all this rest on solid ground and which parts are interpretation, since we have tried to keep that line honest throughout. The physical facts about the equipment are well attested. The belts and boots and wall-sized shields and short stabbing blades really did look and function the way described. And this is the kind of thing archaeology and history can actually confirm. The writer himself explicitly attaches a meaning to each piece, so pairing the shield with faith or the helmet with the mind is not an outside invention. It is right there in the text. Where interpreters go further, and where you should keep a slightly raised eyebrow, is in the more elaborate claims about every strap and hobnail carrying some precise hidden significance the author never spelled out. The broad picture is firmly grounded. Some of the finer decorations hung on it by later readers are exactly that, decorations, and it is worth knowing the difference between the frame and the ornaments people have added to it. What unites this whole cluster of military images, whether the swords are literal or figurative, is the reminder that the original audience did not experience any of it as gentle abstraction. They lived under an occupying army. They saw the belts and the boots and the wall-sized shields every single day, and they knew exactly what a flaming arrow did to an unprepared formation and exactly what the law did to a man who took a blade to someone's head. The writer was not decorating his message with pretty imagery. He was reaching for the most concrete, unmistakable hardware in his reader's world and loading it with meaning, confident they would supply the real, heavy, dangerous object behind every word. When we swap in our vaguer, softer, more cinematic versions, we are not just missing a history lesson, we are diffusing the metaphor, turning a description of real armor built by real engineers into a comfortable abstraction it was never meant to be. Put the actual first-century hardware back, and the whole passage tightens into something you can feel the weight of. That same problem, reading past the concrete thing to a vaguer version, has an even sneakier cousin, which is reading past certain verses altogether because they look too small and functional to matter. Every long text has them, the little connective sentences that seem to exist only to get you from one important scene to the next, the literary equivalent of a hallway between two grand rooms. Most people breeze through them on autopilot, and most of the time that is fine, but a handful of these apparently minor, skippable verses turn out to be carrying an astonishing amount of weight, holding up entire ideas while disguised as throwaway transitions. Slow down at the right hallway, and you find it is actually load-bearing. Part of why this happens is simply how reading works. The eye and the mind are trained to hunt for the payoff, the dramatic line, the quotable moment, and they treat everything in between as connective filler to be crossed as quickly as possible on the way to the next peak. In a novel or a news article, that instinct usually serves you fine. But this particular collection was assembled by writers who were often at their most deliberate precisely in the connective tissue, tucking crucial hinges into sentences that look, to a payoff-hunting reader, like nothing more than stage directions. The result is that the fastest readers frequently miss the most carefully placed material, sailing past a load-bearing beam because it was disguised as a doorframe. The fix is not to read slower everywhere, which would be exhausting, but to develop a suspicion of the too convenient transition, the verse that seems to exist only to move you along, and to occasionally stop and ask what it is quietly holding up. Consider one of the quietest verses in the entire resurrection account, a detail so mundane that it barely registers on a first read. When the followers rush to the empty tomb, one of them notices the burial cloths lying there, and then adds a strangely specific observation. The smaller cloth that had covered the head was not lying with the other wrappings, but was folded or rolled up, off by itself in a separate place. That is it. A note about laundry arrangement, essentially, tucked into the most dramatic morning in the whole story. To picture why this registered as significant to the first observers, it helps to know a little about how a body was prepared for burial in that culture. It was not simply laid down in a spare sheet. The body was wrapped in strips of linen, often packed with a substantial quantity of aromatic spices and resins, and a separate, smaller cloth, essentially a face or sweat cloth, was placed over the head. This was a deliberate, somewhat elaborate process, and the result was a snugly bound form, not a loosely draped one. So when the followers arrived and found the linen wrappings lying there without a body in them and the head cloth set apart and folded on its own, they were not looking at a rumpled bed. They were looking at the aftermath of that careful process, undone in a way that made no ordinary sense. The wrappings still in their arrangement, but empty, as though whatever had filled them had simply exited without disturbing the shape. And this humble little detail has attracted one of the most charming and most thoroughly made-up explanations in modern circulation. So let us handle it honestly, because you have almost certainly heard the myth. The popular story goes like this. Supposedly, in ancient dining custom, when a master finished a meal and was done with the table, he would toss his napkin down, crumpled, signaling to the servant that the meal was over and the table could be cleared. But if he folded his napkin neatly and set it aside, it was a coded message meaning he was not finished and would be coming back, so do not touch anything. And therefore, the story concludes with a satisfying flourish. The neatly folded headcloth in the tomb was a deliberate signal meaning, essentially, I am coming back. It is a lovely little sermon illustration, the kind that makes an audience nod appreciatively. It is also, unfortunately, folklore with no historical footing whatsoever. There is no documented ancient custom of napkin folding as a coded I will return message. It appears to be a modern invention that spread precisely because it is so charming and so easy to repeat. One of those stories that is too good to check. And here is the thing worth savoring. The real meaning, once you drop the invented napkin code, is actually simpler and stronger. Picture the scene as the first followers would have processed it. If the body had been stolen, as some would immediately assume, grave robbers do not tidy up. Thieves working in a hurry, committing a serious crime, do not carefully unwrap a corpse and then pause to neatly fold the headcloth and arrange the wrappings in orderly piles before fleeing. That is absurd. You grab the body, cloths and all, and you run. The very orderliness of the scene argues against theft. The wrappings left behind in a calm, deliberate arrangement with the headcloth set apart on its own point not to a frantic robbery but to something unhurried and intentional. A body that had passed through the cloths and left them in quiet order rather than a body that had been yanked out of them. The detail is doing real theological work. It just does not need a fictional napkin tradition to do it. And it is a small lesson in how a true and understated observation often beats a false and dramatic one. There is a sharper contrast hiding here too, one the same writer seems to have set up on purpose a few chapters earlier. Not long before, he had described another man being called back to life from a tomb, and that man had emerged still completely bound up in his burial wrappings, so tightly wound that he could barely move, and the onlookers had to be told to unwrap him and set him loose. That earlier return to life was a resuscitation, a man brought back into his ordinary mortal existence still tangled in the cloths of death, a temporary reprieve for someone who would eventually die again like everyone else. The empty tomb presents the exact opposite picture. Here, the cloths are left behind entirely, lying collapsed and orderly, because the one who wore them did not need to be freed from them by anyone. He had passed through and out of them into something the wrappings could no longer hold. Set the two scenes side by side and the folded cloth stop being a stray domestic detail and become a deliberate signal that this is a fundamentally different kind of event. Not a body climbing back into its old life still wearing the trappings of the grave, but a body that has left the grave and its wrappings permanently behind. Another of these deceptively small verses does something almost cosmic in scope while pretending to be an aside about the purpose of the community of believers. Most people, if asked what that community is for, would answer with the obvious and reasonable stuff. Gathering together, encouraging one another, spreading the message, doing good in the neighborhood, all true. But one short line makes a claim so much larger and stranger that people tend to read right over it, probably because it sounds too odd to be doing what it is actually doing. It states that one purpose of this community is to put the vast, many-sided wisdom of God on display, and here's the part that stops you if you catch it, on display specifically before the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. In other words, the audience for this exhibition is not primarily the neighbors or the wider public at all. The audience is the unseen powers we touched on earlier, the spiritual authorities operating behind the visible world. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment because it is genuinely bold. It suggests that the ragtag assembly of ordinary, flawed people, the group that so often looks unimpressive and squabbles over trivialities, is functioning as a kind of living demonstration piece staged for an unseen audience, a showcase intended to reveal something about the divine wisdom to the powers watching from beyond the curtain. And the thing being demonstrated is, in this framing, the sheer improbability of the whole arrangement. Millions of wildly different people from every background and language and social station and moral track record, people who by every earthly logic should have nothing to do with one another, somehow gathered under one roof of grace. The point being made to the watching powers is essentially, look what can be done, look at what mercy can assemble out of this unlikely raw material. The word chosen for that wisdom sharpens the image in a way translation tends to blur. The term reaches back to the idea of something many-colored, the sort of word you might use for an intricately embroidered fabric or a tapestry woven from countless different threads and shades. So the wisdom being put on show is not a single flat idea, but something richly varied, multicolored, the way a woven cloth gets its beauty precisely from the number of different strands running through it. Which fits the demonstration perfectly because the thing supposedly dazzling the unseen audience is exactly that variety. The astonishing range of mismatched human beings threaded together into one fabric. A single color proves nothing. It is the sheer number of clashing threads somehow forming one coherent piece that makes the powers lean in. And the original word for the wisdom on display was quietly already carrying that meaning of many-colored intricacy before anyone even reached the part about the audience. What makes this genuinely counterintuitive, and probably another reason people skim right past it, is that the exhibit works precisely through what looks like weakness. If you wanted to impress unseen powers, you would presumably assemble something magnificent, a gathering of the impressive and the accomplished. Instead, the demonstration is built out of the overlooked, the failed, the unremarkable, and the formerly written off, the exact people any respectable observer would have dismissed. And that appears to be the entire point being made to the watching authorities. Not look how impressive these people are, but look what can be made out of people this unpromising. The power on display is not the quality of the raw material, but the improbability of the result, which means the very ordinariness of the assembly, the thing that makes us skip the verse, is the thing the verse is actually pointing at. The unimpressiveness is the exhibit. It reframes the entire enterprise from a modest social club into an exhibit with a supernatural gallery attendance, which is an enormous idea to hang on a single verse most people skim past on the way to something that sounds more important. The last of these load-bearing small verses is really a pair of them, separated by several chapters, and together they pull off a quiet magic trick, where a promise made in one scene comes true, precisely and traceably, just a few pages later, if only you are paying enough attention to notice the connection. Near the very start of the account of the early movement, the central figure gives his followers what amounts to a travel itinerary for the message, laying out the route it will take, starting in the home city, then spreading through the surrounding home region, then into the neighboring territory of a people the locals rather look down on, and finally out to the distant ends of the earth. It reads like a mission statement, a big picture summary of the plan, the sort of line you nod at and move past. And then the text quietly goes about fulfilling that itinerary right in front of you, step by step, so gradually that most readers never register the map being filled in. A wave of persecution breaks out after the death of an early member of the movement, and the believers, fleeing the danger, scatter. And where do they scatter to? Precisely into the surrounding home region and that neighboring looked-down-upon territory, exactly the next two stops named in the itinerary. The very hardship that looked like a catastrophe turns out to be the mechanism that pushes the message along its predicted route, which is a grimly efficient bit of plot engineering. There is a distinctly human irony threaded through this that makes it even better. The believers do not appear to have set out eagerly to fulfill any itinerary. Left to themselves, they seem to have been perfectly content to stay clustered in the home city, among their own, doing very little of the outward spreading the plan had called for. It took a wave of persecution to pry them loose, which is to say the map got filled in not by enthusiastic obedience, but by people running for safety and inadvertently carrying the message with them as they fled. And there is a second twist that the text reports almost without comment. When the believers scattered, the leadership largely stayed put, meaning the great expansion into new territory was carried out mostly by anonymous, ordinary members whose names we never learned, rather than by the famous figures at the top. Reaching the looked down upon neighboring people in particular was something the movement had to be more or less pushed into, overcoming a good deal of inherited prejudice along the way. The plan advanced, in other words, through reluctance, panic, and accident, as much as through anyone's deliberate zeal, which is a refreshingly honest picture of how big things often actually get done. And then, a little further on, one of those scattered believers ends up on a desert road explaining the message to a court official from a far-off land, a man from a distant realm at the southern edge of the known world, who then carries what he has learned back home with him. The final stop on the itinerary, the distant ends of the earth, gets its first installment through a single traveler on a lonely road, and the map the teacher sketched at the beginning has, within just a handful of chapters, started checking off its own boxes one by one. The choice of that particular traveler is doing quiet work too, because he was about as fitting a marker for the distant ends of the earth as the writer could have picked. He was a high official from a far-off southern kingdom at the very edge of the world as those readers understood it, a foreigner in every sense, returning home to a land most of the audience would have thought of as the outer rim of the map. So the message does not just reach one more individual. Through him it is symbolically launched toward an entire distant realm, carried by a returning dignitary back to a place none of the original followers were ever likely to visit. One conversation on one road quietly plants the message on another continent, which is the storyteller's economical way of showing the last and largest item on the itinerary beginning to come true through the smallest possible means, a single passenger reading a scroll. The reason almost nobody notices this is that the itinerary and its fulfillment are separated by a good deal of narrative, and the connecting verses are exactly the kind of small, functional sentences people skim. But once you see it, you cannot unsee the craftsmanship, a promise planted early, then deliberately harvested a little at a time, with the connective tissue between the two doing the real structural work while looking like mere transition. It is the strongest possible argument for the point this whole stretch has been making, which is that the little sentences matter. The doctrine, the drama, the design, all of it frequently lives not in the grand, quotable set pieces, but in the humble connectors everyone treats as filler. The verses about folded cloths and scattered believers and the purpose of an unlikely gathering. Read at full speed and you get the story. Slow down at the hallways, the transitions, the apparent throwaways, and you find they were quietly holding up the whole house the entire time. Which is a habit worth carrying into everything from here, because the closer we get to the center of all this, the more the smallest details are going to turn out to matter most. Following that thread of small details all the way in leads us to the very center of the whole collection, the events everyone thinks of when they think of this story at all. And here is where the pattern we have been chasing reaches its densest concentration. Because the mechanics of forgiveness in this tradition are never left as floaty abstractions. They are stitched into physical objects, into torn fabric and doomed animals and pinches of salt, as if the writers distrusted pure ideas and insisted on making every spiritual claim carry a tangible weight you could touch. Forgiveness here always seems to come attached to a thing, and the thing usually carries the theology more precisely than any explanation ever could. Start with a moment that flashes by in a single sentence during the central death scene, so quickly that most readers barely register it. At the instant the central figure dies, the text reports that the great curtain in the temple was torn in two. Now, to appreciate why this is not just atmospheric set dressing, you have to understand what that curtain actually was and what it did. This was no ordinary drape you might pull across a window. It was a massive, heavy barrier that sealed off the innermost chamber of the temple, the most sacred space in the entire religious world of that people, the room understood to hold the very presence of the divine. Access to that chamber was forbidden to essentially everyone all year round, with a single narrow exception once annually for one specially prepared official. And even then, the atmosphere was less a casual visit and more the tense procedure of a man entering a space he genuinely believed could kill him if he got it wrong. The curtain existed precisely to keep people out, a fabric wall announcing that the holy presence behind it was sealed away and unapproachable. And this was not a flimsy thing that a strong gust could have handled. By the descriptions that survive, this curtain was enormous, reportedly tall enough to span the height of a several-story building, and woven so thick and dense that it would have taken a team of people straining together just to move it, closer to a heavy tapestry the size of a wall than to anything you would call a drape. Tearing it by hand from the ground up would have been a physical impossibility for any single person, and probably for a crowd. Which is exactly why the way it tore matters so enormously, because a barrier that's substantial does not simply split on its own, and it certainly does not split from the top, where no one could reach, downward through its entire massive length. And the crucial detail, the one the writers go out of their way to specify, is the direction of the tear. The curtain rips from top to bottom, not bottom to top, which is how a human being tearing a cloth would naturally do it, reaching up and pulling down. Top to bottom means the tearing started at a height no person could reach, at the very top of an enormous hanging barrier, and moved downward, which is the storyteller's quiet, unmissable way of saying this was not done by human hands. The barrier that had sealed off the divine presence for centuries was torn open from above, from the side of the one it had been hiding, as if the presence behind it had decided the wall was no longer necessary and reached out and split it open from the top. The whole meaning rides on which direction the fabric went. A barrier torn from below is a break-in. A barrier torn from above is an invitation. The sealed room thrown open from the inside, access to the presence flung wide at the exact moment of the death the writers connect it to. One ripped curtain, one specified direction, and an entire theology of newly opened access is delivered without a word of explanation. One does rather wonder what the temple staff made of arriving to find their most sacred barrier split down its full length by no visible hand. A discovery that must have made for an extremely awkward morning meeting, though the accounts, frustratingly, leave that particular reaction entirely to our imagination. The next object comes from an older and stranger ritual, one most people have never looked at closely even though its name has quietly entered everyday language. On the most solemn day of the religious year, the day set aside for cleansing the whole people of their accumulated wrongs, the central ceremony involved not one animal but two, and the fate of the second one is where things get genuinely fascinating. The two animals were presented together and lots were cast over them, assigning each a completely different destiny. The first was offered in the ordinary sacrificial way, its blood used in the cleansing ritual, representing the price paid. But the second animal was handled in a way that has no parallel anywhere else. The officiant would lay both hands on its head and, in a deliberate symbolic act, transfer onto it the collected wrongs of the entire community, confessing them over the animal so that they were understood to settle onto it. And then this second animal, now symbolically loaded down with a year's worth of the people's guilt, was led out and driven away into the wilderness, carrying all of it off into the empty wastes, never to return. What makes this such a rich image is that it splits the machinery of forgiveness into two visible halves that most people mush together into one vague idea. The first animal handles one half, the price, the blood, the cost that had to be paid. But the second animal handles the other half, the part people rarely think about, the actual removal of the guilt, the carrying of it far away so that it is not merely paid for but genuinely gone, hauled off over the horizon where it can no longer be found. It is one thing to say a debt is settled. It is another to watch the evidence of it physically walk away into the desert and disappear. The ritual insisted on showing both, the covering of the cost and the removal of the stain, as two separate motions, and the tradition reads the later central death as accomplishing that same double action at once, both paying the price and carrying the wrong away. The two goats collapsed into a single event. The everyday phrase we still use for a person who gets saddled with everyone else's blame comes directly from that second animal wandering off into the wilderness, which is a slightly grim origin for such a common expression. There are a couple of extra layers to this ritual that make it even richer. The desolate destination the second animal was driven toward is tied to a mysterious name that scholars still argue about. a term that may point to a specific forbidding location out in the wastes or to something more shadowy, a name for the very place of banishment where guilt was sent to be swallowed up and lost. And later tradition preserves a striking custom attached to the ceremony. A piece of crimson wool was said to be involved, and there was a belief that in a year when the offering had been accepted, this red thread would turn white, a visible signal that the wrong had been wiped clean, drawing on an old image of scarlet stains being washed to the color of snow. Whether or not that detail is historically airtight, it shows how badly the human mind craves a physical sign that forgiveness has actually landed, some tangible proof that the invisible transaction went through, which is precisely the instinct this whole cluster of symbols keeps feeding. The third of these physical symbols is one where a popular explanation has gotten the mechanics almost entirely backward, and setting it straight makes the real meaning far sharper. There is a famous line in which the central figure tells his listeners that they are the salt of the earth, and warns that if salt loses its saltiness, it is good for nothing except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. A very common modern explanation claims this refers to the practice of scattering salt on roads, so that salt, which had lost its potency, ended up literally spread on the ground for people to walk on. The trouble is that the image of salting roads is drawn from a much later era and a much colder climate, essentially a modern winter road maintenance practice projected backward onto a warm, ancient landscape where nobody was de-icing anything, because there was very little ice to worry about and salt was far too valuable to waste on pavement. The real resonance runs in two other directions, both more interesting than the road salting mix-up. First, salt in that culture carried heavy ceremonial meaning, sealing agreements and accompanying offerings as a symbol of permanence and loyalty, a preservative that does not spoil and therefore stood for a bond that does not break. This was not a loose association either. The ceremonial rules actually required that salt accompany the offerings brought to the altar, so that every single sacrifice came with its pinch of salt as a standing reminder of that permanent, unspoiling bond. Salt was not an optional garnish on the religious life of that people. It was written into the instructions, present at the altar by command, which means that to an audience raised on those practices, invoking salt was automatically invoking the idea of a covenant meant to last forever. The seasoning on the table and the seal on the sacred agreement were, in their minds, the same substance carrying the same promise. It also helps to remember just how genuinely valuable the stuff was, because that is what makes the warning bite. Salt in the ancient world was not the throwaway commodity it is now, the thing we absent-mindedly knock over and toss a pinch of over our shoulder. It was a serious economic good, so prized that laborers and soldiers were, by a well-worn tradition, sometimes compensated partly in it, which is the very origin of the modern word for the paycheck we all still collect. Something that costs almost nothing today was, back then, worth guarding and trading and building customs around. So the image of salt that has somehow gone flavorless and useless would have struck that audience as not just a shame, but very nearly an absurdity, like precious metal that had mysteriously stopped being worth anything, a valuable thing that had betrayed the single quality that made it valuable in the first place. The insult lands so much harder once you know the thing being described as good for nothing was, in their world, anything but cheap. To speak of salt to that audience was partly to invoke the idea of a lasting, faithful covenant. Second, salt was the great preservative of the ancient world, the thing that kept meat and fish from rotting in an age with no refrigeration, so its entire value lay in its power to prevent decay. Salt that had somehow lost that preserving power was not just less useful, it was a contradiction in terms. A preservative that no longer preserves, worthless for the one job that gave it any point at all. And there is a companion line in another account that deepens it further, a strange remark about everyone being salted with fire, which pulls in yet another association, salt as something that comes through burning and testing, a symbol of purity refined and covenant loyalty proven under heat. So the humble pinch of salt is doing triple duty, standing for an unbreakable covenant, for the power to hold back decay, and for a loyalty tested and refined by fire. And the warning is not really about roads at all, but about becoming the kind of thing that has lost the very quality that defined it. Line these three up and the shared lesson is hard to miss. In this tradition, forgiveness and cleansing are never presented as bare concepts floating in the air. They are always anchored to something physical, a torn curtain, a departing animal, a grain of salt. because the writers seem to have understood that a symbol carries theology more precisely and more memorably than an abstraction ever can. You can forget a definition of forgiveness 5 minutes after you hear it, but the image of a barrier torn open from the top down, or a guilt-laden animal disappearing over a dune, or a preservative that has forgotten how to preserve, lodges in the mind and keeps working on you. The physical object is not a decoration wrapped around the idea, it is the idea made solid enough to touch, which is exactly why these details reward the slow reader who stops to ask what the thing is actually doing there. And once you start weighing what these events actually cost, you arrive at the two scenes where the price is paid most heavily and where the surface reading badly undersells what is happening underneath. Both are usually treated as familiar, almost comfortable episodes, and both turn out to be far heavier than the casual version suggests once you look at the language, the geography, and even the medicine behind them. Consider the sequence where the central figure, having gone out into the wilderness and fasted for a long stretch, is confronted with a series of temptations. This scene often gets read as a slightly abstract test of willpower, a spiritual formality that everyone already knows he passes, which drains it of nearly all its tension. But the three temptations map with uncanny precision onto a much later summary of the fundamental categories of human temptation: the craving of physical appetite, the craving triggered by what the eyes take in, and the prideful hunger for status and self-importance. The first temptation targets bodily hunger directly, urging a starving man to turn stones into bread, the appetite of the flesh. The second temptation shifts the pressure to a different lever entirely. He is taken to the highest point of the temple and dared to throw himself down, on the reasoning that if he is who he claims to be, rescue would surely arrive in dramatic fashion for all to see. This is the temptation of spectacle, the urge to prove yourself with a flashy public display, to force a guarantee out of the divine on your own terms and put on a show that removes all doubt and all risk. It plays on the craving for proof and impressiveness, the desire to skip quiet trust in favor of a stunt with a guaranteed safety net, and he turns it down flatly, refusing to treat the relationship as a dare or to demand a private demonstration on demand. But it is the final temptation that most people flatten into nothing, and it may be the heaviest of all. In that last temptation, the offer on the table is nothing less than authority over all the kingdoms of the world, every earthly realm handed over in a single transaction. Read quickly, this sounds almost cartoonish, a villain offering a bribe so large it is easy to dismiss. But think about what it actually represented in the logic of the story. The central figure had, according to the whole arc of the narrative, come precisely to gain authority over the world, but by a specific and agonizing route that ran straight through suffering and death. And here he is being offered the exact destination, complete dominion over the earth, without the terrible road required to reach it. It was, in effect, a shortcut, the promise of the crown without the cross, the end goal delivered instantly and painlessly if he would just take the easier path. Framed that way, this is not a silly cartoon bribe at all. It may be the single most excruciating temptation a person in that position could face, the offer to have everything he came for while skipping the very thing that gave it meaning and cost him everything. A shortcut to the destination you were going to reach anyway at the price of the journey that was the entire point is a genuinely brutal thing to dangle in front of an exhausted person, and reading the scene as a formality misses just how sharp the hook really was. There is a pointed contrast lurking underneath the whole episode too once you set it beside the story's opening trouble. The first representative of humanity, as the tradition frames it, failed his test in a garden overflowing with abundance, surrounded by everything he could possibly need, with a full stomach and every comfort, and still reached for the one forbidden thing. The second faces his test in the opposite conditions entirely, out in a barren wilderness, starving after a long fast, stripped of every comfort and pushed to the edge of physical endurance, and holds firm. One fails amid plenty, the other stands amid want. The setting is almost aggressively symmetrical, as if the story were deliberately staging a rematch under reversed and far harder conditions, which is exactly the sort of quiet structural rhyme that rewards anyone reading the two scenes together rather than centuries apart. And here is where the enemy's whole design in that wilderness comes into focus, because every one of those temptations was, at bottom, an offer to reach the goal without paying the price. Bread without waiting, proof without trust, a crown without a cross. The through line running under all three was the same seductive shortcut. Take the destination and skip the suffering. So when he refuses them, he is not just passing a character test. He is deliberately choosing the long, costly road when an easier one was being held open right in front of him. Which means everything that follows, the dread, the crushing, the cup he does not want to drink, is the direct consequence of that refusal in the desert. He turned down the painless path early, and the bill for that choice comes due later, in full, which is exactly why the later scenes carry the weight they do. The wilderness was where the shortcut was rejected. The garden is where the cost of rejecting it arrives. The weight becomes even more visible in the scene that comes near the very end, in a garden the night before the death, and it starts with a name. The place where the central figure goes to pray in his final hours of freedom has a name that literally means something like oil press. It was a grove where olives were processed, and the way you processed olives in that era was to crush them under enormous stone weight, pressing down on them relentlessly until the oil was forced out. So the man goes to pray in his moment of deepest anguish in a place whose very name describes the act of being crushed under crushing weight until something is squeezed out, which is either a remarkable coincidence or a piece of geography the writers could not resist pointing at. He is quite literally in the press, and what the accounts describe happening to his body in that garden is not poetic exaggeration, but very likely a real and documented medical phenomenon. The text reports that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. And it turns out there is an actual, if rare, medical condition in which extreme psychological stress causes the tiny blood vessels around the sweat glands to rupture, so that a person under unbearable strain can literally sweat blood. It is a recognized response to the kind of terror and anguish most people never come close to experiencing, the body being pushed to a physiological breaking point by the sheer weight of dread. So the detail that reads like flowery language, sweat like drops of blood, may well be a clinically accurate description of a man whose distress had reached the outer edge of what a human body can physically endure. The oil press was pressing, and the pressure had reached the point of rupturing him from the inside, which is a far heavier picture than the peaceful, softly lit garden scene most people carry in their heads. The loneliness of it sharpens the weight further. He had brought his closest companions along and asked them to stay awake with him, to keep him company through the worst hours of his life. And they, exhausted and probably a little overwhelmed, kept drifting off to sleep. So the man is enduring this crushing anguish essentially alone, returning again and again to find his friends unconscious, which is a very human and very sad detail, the sort of small abandonment anyone who has ever needed support and found everyone asleep can feel in their chest. And the thing he pleads about in that garden is described using the image of a cup, asking whether this cup might pass from him, drawing on an old symbol where a cup stood for a portion handed to you to drink, whether of blessing or of bitter judgment. He is staring at a cup he does not want to drink and asking, in effect, whether there is any other way, before accepting that there is not. The whole scene is a man alone in the dark, in a place named for crushing, drinking something he dreads to the bottom. Even the location of the death itself carries a buried layer that ties the whole story back to its beginning. The site was known by a name meaning the place of the skull, usually explained by the shape of the hill or its use as a place of execution. But an old tradition attached a much stranger claim to that spot, holding that it was the burial place of the skull of the very first man, the one from the opening chapters of the whole collection. Whether or not there is any history behind that legend, the symbolic resonance it creates is striking, because it means that as the central figure died, his blood ran down onto the ground directly above the head of the first human, the one whose story set the whole problem in motion. And that image connects to one of the oldest lines in the entire book, a cryptic early promise that a descendant of the first woman would one day crush the head of the serpent that had deceived them, taking a wound in the process. The blood of the one the tradition calls the second representative of humanity, running down over the skull of the first, striking at the head, is precisely the picture that ancient promise had sketched in the opening pages. The geography, the legend, and the earliest prophecy all fold together into a single dense image at the place of the skull, which is a lot of meaning to hang on the name of a hill. The pattern runs even deeper when you notice how neatly the ending mirrors the beginning. The whole trouble, in the story's own logic, started in a garden, at a tree, with a first representative of humanity reaching for something forbidden, and bringing ruin down on everyone after him. And the tradition reads the death scene as the deliberate reversal of that opening, a second representative of humanity. On a wooden cross the early writers pointedly called a tree, undoing at another tree what was done at the first one. Where the first man grasped at what was not his and lost everything, the second is described as giving up everything he had every right to keep. The story that broke in a garden at a tree is portrayed as being mended at a tree, by a man whose obedience runs exactly counter to the first man's grasping, which is the kind of symmetry that either strikes you as elegant design or as a community reading its ending very carefully back into its beginning. Either way, the rhyme is unmistakable once you hear it. Put these details side by side and the point is unavoidable. The true scale of what this story claims was paid only becomes visible when you slow down enough to catch the language of an oil press, the medicine of blood and sweat, the geography of a skull-shaped hill, and the logic of a shortcut refused. Read at a comfortable distance, these are familiar scenes we think we already understand. Read up close, through the specific words and places and even the human physiology involved, they turn into something far weightier, a portrait of a cost most retellings quietly shrink down to a manageable size. The details are not trivia, they are the only way to feel the actual weight of the thing. Which brings us at last to the loose ends, because for all the meanings we have managed to recover across this whole journey, the collection is also stubbornly full of moments that simply refuse to resolve, passages that scholars and readers have chewed on for centuries without ever reaching agreement. And rather than pretend these have tidy answers, it is more honest and frankly more fun to lay a few of them on the table and let you argue about them yourselves, because some of these puzzles are genuinely open, and your guess is very nearly as good as anyone else's. Take one of the strangest short episodes in the entire collection, a bizarre little story about two prophets that reads almost like a riddle with the solution torn off. A younger prophet is given very specific instructions by the divine, including a strange command not to eat or drink in a certain place and to return home by a different road. An older prophet then seeks him out and remarkably lies to him, falsely claiming to have received a message reversing those instructions. The younger prophet believes the lie, breaks his commands, and on his way home is killed by a lion. And here's the part that has baffled everyone for millennia. The lion, having killed the man, does not devour him or flee, but stands calmly beside the body next to the man's donkey, and the donkey, which should have bolted in terror, also just stands there, the three of them frozen in an eerie tableau by the roadside. The whole scene is loaded with unanswered questions. Why does the deceiver escape consequences while the deceived one pays with his life? What is the meaning of the lion that kills but does not eat, the predator behaving in a way no predator behaves? People have proposed countless interpretations, and none has ever truly settled it. So this is one to sit with and puzzle over on your own, because nobody can hand you the answer with a straight face. The strangeness only compounds when you reach the end of the episode. The old prophet who told the lie, upon hearing what happened, goes out, retrieves the body, mourns over the younger man he essentially sent to his death, and then gives instructions that when he himself dies, he should be buried in the very same grave right beside the man his deception killed. Which is a genuinely bewildering emotional turn, the deceiver grieving and choosing to spend eternity next to his victim, and it only sharpens the central mystery rather than resolving it. Some readers see the whole thing as a severe lesson about obeying a clear instruction even when someone with apparent authority tells you otherwise, arguing that the younger prophet's fatal error was trusting a second-hand reversal over what he had been told directly. Others focus on the unnatural calm of the lion as a sign that the death was a deliberate act of judgment rather than a random accident, a predator restrained to make a point. But every reading leaves loose ends flapping, which is precisely why the episode has kept people arguing for so many centuries and why I would genuinely love to see what the comment section makes of it. Another enduring puzzle is smaller and hides inside one of the most famous scenes in the whole story. The moment a prominent follower denies knowing the central figure 3 times before a rooster crows. It seems straightforward until you learn a curious wrinkle. According to certain ancient regulations preserved in the traditional legal writings of the period, keeping roosters and hens inside the holy city was actually discouraged, on the grounds that the birds scratched around in unclean things and posed a ritual purity problem. Which raises an obvious question. If chickens were not supposed to be kept in the city, whose rooster was doing the crowing? One intriguing theory suggests the crowing might not refer to a literal bird at all, but to a specific signal. A trumpet blast sounded from the temple at a fixed point in the early morning, which was known by a name related to the rooster and marked a particular watch of the night. On that reading, the follower denied his teacher 3 times before the morning temple signal sounded, not before an actual bird cleared its throat. But in the interest of honesty, this is far from settled, because the rule was not absolute, and a rooster could easily have belonged to someone living just outside the walls, or to the occupying soldiers who were not bound by the local purity customs and could keep whatever birds they pleased. So it remains a genuinely open question whether the crowing was a bird or a bugle, and it is exactly the kind of thing worth arguing about in the comments. There is even a small wrinkle inside the accounts themselves that keeps the puzzle alive, because they do not all describe the crowing identically, with one version noting the sound happening more than once, which the trumpet signal theory handles rather neatly since the temple horn was blown at set repeated points, and which the ordinary bird theory handles just as easily since roosters, as anyone who has slept near one can tell you, are not exactly known for restraint or good timing. Both explanations survive the wrinkle, which is precisely why neither has won. It is a lovely little reminder that even in the most familiar scene in the whole story, a scene painted on 1,000 walls, there is a small unresolved question hiding in plain sight the moment you ask a slightly harder version of it than usual. The third puzzle sits in a much darker corner and concerns an ancient poem full of harsh pronouncements against a betrayer. After the betrayal at the heart of the story, when the remaining followers gather to select a replacement for the one who turned traitor, their leader quotes an old poetic line about someone's position being taken by another, applying it directly to the situation. This has led to a long-standing theory that the ancient poem, written centuries earlier, was in some sense secretly about the betrayer all along, describing his fate in advance. One verse in particular, about a man who hounded the poor and the brokenhearted to death, gets read by some as a chillingly specific portrait of the betrayer written long before he was born. It is a provocative idea, and it fits the pattern of hidden foreshadowing we have seen throughout. But it should be offered as a theory to debate rather than a fact to accept, because the original poem was almost certainly composed about the writer's own enemies in his own time, and reading it as a coded prophecy about one specific later individual is an interpretive leap, not a settled conclusion, which is precisely why it makes such good material for a discussion rather than a lecture. The line that actually got applied is worth knowing because it is narrower and cleaner than the harsh curses around it. The follower reaching for the old poem lands specifically on a phrase about someone's position or office being taken up by another, and uses just that piece to justify replacing the traitor with a new member, filling the empty seat he had left behind. Which is a much more modest use of the poem than claiming the whole grim thing was secretly a biography of the betrayer, and it is a good example of how a single applied line can get stretched, by enthusiastic later readers, into a far larger claim than the person quoting it ever actually made. Where the honest boundary sits between the line that was used and the theory built on top of it is, once again, a perfect thing to hash out below rather than settle from up here. And that is the perfect note to end on, because puzzles like these are the whole reason a collection this old refuses to stop generating conversation. For every hidden meaning that clicks satisfyingly into place, there is another that stubbornly resists, and both kinds are part of what makes the text worth reading slowly rather than skimming. Over the course of this journey, we have dug through names that turned out to be prophecies, numbers that worked like a code, cultural details that flipped familiar stories inside out, invisible conflicts running behind ordinary events, sketches of a single picture drawn across 1,000 years, lives lived out as messages, words carrying 2 meanings at once, military hardware loaded with significance, tiny verses holding up enormous ideas, physical objects carrying the mechanics of forgiveness and the true weight of a cost most retellings shrink. 25 hidden meanings, more or less, depending on how you were counting, which brings us right back to the challenge from the very beginning. So here's your assignment, and it is the one thing I genuinely want from you before you go. Tell me your number, write it in the comments as your score out of 25, and be honest about it, because I said at the start that I would bet even the sharpest, most theologically well-read among you would not walk away with a clean 25. And I am extremely curious to find out whether I was right. And while you're down there, throw in your best theory about that last puzzle. The lion that killed a man and then politely stood guard over the body next to an unbothered donkey, because I have read a dozen explanations and I am still not satisfied with any of them, and I suspect this comment section can do better than the scholars have. While you are at it, remind me where in the world you are watching from and what the hour is where you are right now, the way some of you did back at the start, because I never get tired of seeing this strange little late-night crowd assemble from every corner of the map. If any of this made you look at a familiar story a little differently or made you want to slow down and read the boring verses twice, then follow along. And if you want to help keep these deep dives going, there are gentle ways to do that with a membership or a bit of support, entirely as you like and with zero pressure, because you being here at all is already the part that matters. Now let those lights you dimmed at the very beginning stay low a little longer, because there is always another layer, always another detail hiding in plain sight, and we have only ever scratched the surface. Until the next dive into everything hiding just beneath the words, keep looking closer.